From George Washington to George H.W. Bush, this is the story of how U.S. presidents died in their final moments, the illnesses, the assassinations, and the silent struggles that history rarely tells. In this video, you will witness the private battles behind public power, the human vulnerabilities of the men who shaped a nation, and the fateful events that ended their lives. You will learn how some presidents, like Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, were struck down suddenly by bullets, forever altering the course of history. You will see others, from Thomas Jefferson to Ronald Reagan, succumb to disease, age, or lingering health complications, each death marked by quiet dignity, tragedy, or reflection. From Washington's fatal fever treated with bleeding to Bush's peaceful passing after a lifetime of service, every president shared the same ultimate fate: mortality. This is not just a list of names and dates. It is a journey through history, revealing the human stories behind the office, the vulnerabilities that power cannot protect, and the final chapters of men who carried the weight of a nation. By the end, you will understand not only the deaths of American presidents who died in office and after service, but also what their deaths reveal about leadership, mortality, and the passage of time. George Washington, 1799, the death of the first United States president. On the evening of December 12, 1799, George Washington rode out on horseback across the fields of Mount Vernon. It was a bitter winter day, the air heavy with sleet and freezing rain. Washington, as was his habit, oversaw the workings of his estate personally, guiding surveyors and checking his farms. He wore no greatcoat to shield him from the storm, and by the time he returned to the mansion, he was chilled and soaked. Those close to him would later recall that his voice sounded unusually hoarse at supper that night, a small but ominous sign that illness had already begun its work. By the next morning, December 13th, the discomfort had worsened. Washington coughed heavily, his throat raw and inflamed. Still, he carried on with his correspondence and the management of his estate. His household, used to his iron will, thought little of his condition. Yet as the day wore on, the soreness in his throat deepened into swelling, and swallowing became difficult. That night, snow blanketed the grounds of Mount Vernon, and Washington awoke suddenly around 2 a.m., struggling for breath. His throat had constricted so severely that he could hardly speak. He woke his wife, Martha, and reassured her in his deliberate way, insisting that she not rise for his comfort. By dawn on December 14th, however, it was clear that the situation had become dire. Martha called for help. Within hours, physicians arrived, among them Dr. James Craik, Washington's longtime friend and personal doctor. Their methods reflected the best medical knowledge of the 18th century, though by modern eyes they seemed crude and almost barbaric. They prepared the first of several bleedings, lancing his veins to drain what they believed were harmful humors from his body. In total, nearly 5 pints of blood, almost half his body's supply, were drawn from him over the course of the day. At times, Washington protested faintly against the treatments, but always with dignity, consenting to whatever his doctors judged necessary. Between bleedings, the physicians tried other remedies, a mixture of vinegar and sage tea, blistering agents applied to his skin, and even an attempt to clear his throat with a tool that must have caused him immense discomfort. They offered him calomel, a mercury-based purgative, hoping to cleanse his system. None of these measures brought relief. Instead, Washington grew steadily weaker. His voice, once commanding, was reduced to a hoarse whisper. His body, still tall and imposing even in illness, seemed to diminish as exhaustion overtook him. Throughout the day, Washington displayed a calm acceptance of his fate. Those in the room remarked that he remained composed, even resolute, as if determined to set an example in dying as he had in life. At one point, he told his doctors plainly, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." His concern was not for himself, but for those around him. He asked Martha to bring him his two wills, carefully choosing the one he wished to stand and ordering the other destroyed. He instructed that his burial be delayed for 3 days, a common fear of the time being premature interment. As evening fell, Washington's strength failed rapidly. Breathing became laborious, every gasp a battle. Friends and family gathered quietly in the room, watching the first president of the Republic, once the unyielding commander of the Continental Army, reduced to fragility by illness. Around 10 p.m., his final moment arrived. Summoning what voice remained, he whispered 2 words, "'Tis well." With that, he closed his eyes and slipped away into silence. George Washington was 67 years old. His death, sudden though not violent, sent a shock through the nation. The man who had led America to independence, presided over its founding, and refused the crown of monarchy was gone. In Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, churches tolled their bells in mourning. Eulogies declared him the father of his country. Citizens wept openly in the streets. Congress, upon receiving the news, adjourned immediately out of respect. Martha Washington, devastated, retreated into seclusion within the mansion. She ordered their shared bedroom closed and never entered it again. For the rest of her days, she lived in a smaller chamber, unable to face the room where she had watched her husband's final struggle. The medical debate over his death lingered long after. Modern historians and physicians believe Washington likely died from acute bacterial epiglottitis, a swelling of the throat that obstructed his airway. Some have argued that the aggressive bloodletting hastened his decline, depriving him of the strength he needed to survive. Others suggest that even the best care available in his time could not have saved him. What is certain is the symbolism of his passing. With Washington's death, the United States experienced for the first time the loss of a president. The man who had declined the chance at kingship had now faced the one sovereign no leader can escape, death itself. His quiet acceptance, his orderliness even in his final hours, and his resolve not to burden others with fear became part of the mythos that enshrined him as the model statesman. And so, on December 14, 1799, in a chamber of his Mount Vernon estate, beneath the flickering light of candles, the life of George Washington came to its close. The Republic, still fragile and young, mourned not only the loss of a leader, but of the man whose very presence had embodied its strength. The bells tolled, the black crape was hung, and across a grieving nation one truth settled heavily. The father of his country was gone, and the nation he had birthed now stood to face the future without him. John Adams, 1735 to 1826. The twilight of John Adams's life unfolded in the quiet hills of Quincy, Massachusetts. By the 1820s, the second president of the United States was among the last surviving voices of the Revolution. His body, once vigorous and restless, had grown frail. Arthritis gnawed at his joints. Years of public duty and private worry had bent his frame. Yet his mind, though occasionally clouded, still burned with conviction, and his pen still scratched out letters that would become part of America's historical record. In his final years, Adams spent long days seated by the windows of Peacefield, his family home. The orchard outside bloomed in spring, and in winter frost crept over the panes. Visitors described him as alternately cheerful and sharp-tongued, a man who still relished debate, but whose physical strength dwindled month by month. His son, John Quincy Adams, had ascended to the presidency in 1825, a triumph the old patriot lived just long enough to see. Yet Adams himself confessed to friends that he was ready for death whenever it should come. By the summer of 1826, he was 90 years old, a staggering age in a time when few reached such years. His body bore the weight of age with visible struggle. Neighbors who came to call found him mostly confined indoors, his breathing shallow, his speech broken by long pauses. Still, he clung to consciousness, watching from afar as the nation prepared to celebrate 50 years since the Declaration of Independence. On the morning of July 4, 1826, John Adams awoke for the last time. He had grown weaker in the days leading up to the anniversary, sinking deeper into bed, unable to rise without help. His pulse slowed, his skin grew pale, and his voice, once thundering in the Continental Congress, fell to a whisper. Family gathered at his bedside. The bells of Boston and beyond were already tolling in celebration of the Republic's half-century mark, though the sound would not carry to the chamber where Adams lay. Accounts tell us that Adams remained lucid for much of that morning, drifting in and out of consciousness as those around him wiped his brow and offered him sips of water. He asked little, only murmuring fragments of thoughts, sometimes about God, sometimes about the republic he had helped to found. By afternoon, his breathing had grown labored. His lips moved in what seemed to be a prayer. Shortly after 6 o'clock, John Adams drew in one of his last breaths. He opened his eyes briefly and uttered words that those present would never forget. "Thomas Jefferson survives." With this final phrase, Adams seemed to take comfort in the belief that his lifelong rival, fellow revolutionary, and friend still lived. In truth, Jefferson had died only hours earlier, on the very same day, at Monticello in Virginia. Adams slipped away quietly. He was 90 years the longest-lived president until then, and one of the last great figures of the revolutionary generation. His death on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence seemed almost preordained, a poetic closing of the circle he had helped to open. News of Adams's death spread swiftly. Bells rang in Boston. Black drapes were hung across New England. Newspapers from Maine to Georgia wrote of the extraordinary coincidence that both Adams and Jefferson had perished on the same day, golden jubilee of American independence. For a young nation, it seemed a sign, a divine affirmation that the founders had handed their legacy back to the people just as the Republic marked its first half-century. In Quincy, Adams was laid to rest in the family tomb at the United First Parish Church, where he would later be joined by his wife, Abigail, and his son, John Quincy Adams. Visitors still come to stand before the stone sarcophagi, where the line between private grief and national memory has blurred. John Adams's death was not violent nor sudden. It was the slow extinguishing of a man who had spent his youth in rebellion, his middle years in governance, and his old age in reflection. On his sickbed, surrounded by family, he carried himself into history with the same stubborn dignity that had marked his long life. And as the fireworks of July 4th burst over the skies of the young nation, Americans mourned while they celebrated, understanding that they had witnessed not only the death of a president, but the passing of an age. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826. At Monticello, the great hilltop home he had designed, Thomas Jefferson spent his final years surrounded by books, papers, and the fading traces of wealth that had long since slipped beyond his grasp. Age had diminished the tall Virginian who once strode through the halls of power. By the mid-1820s, Jefferson's frame was frail, his hair had turned to silver, and his body was increasingly racked with disease. Chronic diarrhea plagued him, likely from years of intestinal illness. Rheumatism stiffened his joints, and a urinary tract disorder left him in constant discomfort. Yet his mind, though slowed, retained flashes of brilliance, and his pen continued to shape words that future generations would treasure. Jefferson was, by then, burdened with deep financial ruin. The vast estate he had inherited and expanded stood mortgaged beyond saving, and enslaved families labored in fields that no longer yielded enough to cover his debts. The author of the Declaration of Independence, a man who had dreamed of liberty, spent his last years entangled in contradictions he could never fully reconcile. Visitors noted that while his household remained warm and welcoming, Jefferson often seemed distant, as though weighed down by thoughts that stretched far beyond his mountaintop. In June of 1826, Jefferson's strength began to fail. His doctors recorded fever, swelling, and an overall wasting of his body. The once robust revolutionary now needed assistance even to sit upright. Servants carried him from bed to chair and back again, while family members gathered, knowing the end drew near. The nation prepared to celebrate its 50th 4th of July, yet Jefferson's household prepared for something different, his last breath. On July 2nd, Jefferson slipped into a long, restless decline. He complained of thirst, asking for water and cool cloths. His breathing grew shallow, interrupted by sighs. By July 3rd, he could scarcely whisper, yet his mind seemed fixed on one date alone. "Is it the 4th?" he asked repeatedly. His attendants answered gently, reassuring him though the day had not yet come. Time for him had narrowed to a single point, the anniversary of independence. Through the night of July 3rd, his condition worsened. Neighbors who hurried to Monticello found the house hushed, the once busy halls silenced except for footsteps to and from the sick room. Jefferson lay propped among pillows, his body shrunken, his voice a thread. The family recorded that he remained calm, drifting in and out of sleep, murmuring occasionally, but with little strength to form sentences. As dawn broke on July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration he had drafted with his own hand, Jefferson awoke briefly. He asked again, faintly, if it was the 4th. At last, attendants could truthfully tell him it was. A quiet satisfaction seemed to settle over him. Through the day, his breathing grew weaker. By early afternoon, around 1 o'clock, Thomas Jefferson exhaled for the last time. He was 83 years old. The coincidence was staggering. At Monticello in Virginia, Jefferson's life had ended only hours before his rival and friend, John Adams, would die in Quincy, Massachusetts. The two men, once bitter political enemies, reconciled in later years through a remarkable correspondence, had departed within the same sunlit day, the jubilee of the nation they had helped to bring into being. To Americans, it seemed almost divine, as if Providence had chosen that the architects of independence should vanish together precisely on its 50th anniversary. News of Jefferson's death swept across the country with solemn swiftness. Newspapers framed the event as a moment of awe as much as grief. "Another father of the Republic has descended to the tomb," one editor wrote. For many, the passing of Jefferson and Adams together was proof that the Revolutionary era itself had come to a natural close, sealing its legacy with a final gesture of symmetry. At Monticello, Jefferson's body was laid to rest according to his wishes. He had carefully composed the epitaph for his tombstone, instructing that it should not list the offices he had held, not the presidency, not the governorship, not even foreign minister to France. Instead, it read, "Author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." These were the accomplishments he wished posterity to remember, the enduring ideas over the fleeting power. Yet even in death, contradictions lingered. Jefferson's estate was so indebted that much of Monticello, along with its enslaved workers, would be sold at auction. Visitors arriving to pay respects found not only mourning, but also the quiet desperation of a family ruined by financial collapse. It was a sobering reminder that even the brightest of the founders had lived in the shadow of debts and compromises. Still, the nation's memory of Jefferson's passing dwelt not on the estate's decline, but on the extraordinary symmetry of his final day. He had clung to life long enough to see the 4th dawn one last time, as if refusing to depart until the anniversary of the Declaration had been fulfilled. For Americans, it was more than a coincidence. It was a symbol, a sacred closing of the chapter he had helped to write. Thomas Jefferson died as he had lived, a man of contradictions, of soaring ideals and uneasy realities, but one whose words would echo far beyond Monticello. On that July afternoon in 1826, as the nation celebrated its half-century of independence, Jefferson's death joined his life to the mythology of America itself, inseparable, unforgettable, and bound forever to the meaning of the 4th of July. James Madison, 1751 to 1836. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, lived longer than nearly all of his contemporaries. By the time he entered his mid-80s, he was the last of the founding fathers still alive, a living link to a revolutionary age that had already passed into history. His presence alone reminded Americans of the fragile beginnings of their republic. But by the mid-1830s, Madison's body was failing him piece by piece. At his Virginia plantation, Montpelier, Madison spent his final years confined to a quiet routine. He had long been plagued by fragile health. As a younger man, he had endured seizures, weakness, and what contemporaries described as bilious attacks. In old age, those ailments deepened. He suffered from rheumatism, constant fatigue, and swelling of the legs, dropsy, as doctors then called it. His once sharp eyes grew clouded, and his voice weakened to a rasp. Yet Madison's mind remained alert far longer than his body. Visitors who traveled to Montpelier found him propped in a chair, tiny and bent, but still eager to converse. He spoke of the Constitutional Convention with startling clarity, recalling the debates and compromises of 1787. His words carried the weight of one who had seen the nation forged and tested. Younger statesmen came to sit at his side, hoping to carry away fragments of wisdom from the last living founder. By early 1836, Madison's decline accelerated. His appetite disappeared, and his body wasted to a frail shell. He had difficulty standing, needing attendants to lift him between his bed and chair. Still, he tried to preserve dignity, dressing neatly in the mornings and greeting family with formal courtesy. Dolly Madison, his devoted wife, cared for him tirelessly, watching as his strength ebbed away. In June of that year, doctors recognized the end was near. Madison could no longer swallow solid food. He lived on sips of broth and water, which even then caused him discomfort. His breathing grew shallow, and his heart faltered. One physician suggested opium to ease his final days, but Madison declined, unwilling to cloud his mind. He preferred clarity, even in suffering. On the morning of June 28, 1836, James Madison lay propped among pillows in his bedchamber. His family and servants gathered quietly nearby. Weak as he was, he roused himself one final time, asking what day it was. Told that it was Tuesday, he sighed faintly. He had hoped, some said, to linger until July 4th, so that his death might echo those of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson a decade earlier. But his body would not wait. As dawn broke, Madison slipped in and out of consciousness. He seemed calm, his lips moving faintly as if in prayer. Around 6 o'clock, he exhaled and did not draw breath again. At 85 years old, the last of the founding fathers was gone. His death brought a somber recognition to the nation. Newspapers noted that with Madison's passing, the generation that had written the Constitution and steered the Revolution was no more. Bells tolled in cities across the Union. Sermons were preached in his honor, not with the fiery mourning that had followed Washington, Adams, or Jefferson, but with a gentler reverence, as if the country understood that an era had quietly closed. Madison was buried at Montpelier, beneath the trees of the Virginia soil he had always called home. His grave was marked with a simple monument, far humbler than his contributions. Dolly, widowed and burdened by debt, would live on for more than a decade after him, tending his memory even as her own fortunes declined. Madison's death lacked the grandeur of his predecessors. There was no dramatic coincidence of dates, no sudden violence, no poetic last words that echoed across history. His was a slower fading, the long diminishing of a life that had been careful, methodical, and restrained just as his political career had been. Yet for many, that in itself was fitting. James Madison, who had written the architecture of the Constitution, left the stage not in spectacle but in quiet dignity, his work already immortal in the document that outlived him. And so, as summer heat rolled across Virginia in 1836, the Republic mourned the last of its founding generation. Madison's sickbed had been the final witness to an age of revolutionaries. With his death, the thread that tied the living nation to the moment of its birth was at last broken. James Monroe, 1758 to 1831. By the summer of 1831, James Monroe was an old man of 73, worn down by a lifetime of public service and financial strain. He had once been the vigorous Revolutionary War officer who bled at Trenton, the statesman who shaped foreign policy, and the president whose name was bound to the doctrine that declared the Western Hemisphere closed to European empires. But in the final year of his life, Monroe's body betrayed him. He was living not at his Virginia estate, which debts had forced him to sell, but in New York City, in the home of his daughter Maria and her husband, Samuel Gouverneur. The bustling metropolis was a far cry from the quiet fields of Virginia that Monroe had loved. Here, in a borrowed household, the fifth president faced the steady collapse of his health. Monroe had long battled respiratory illness. By the late 1820s, the cough that had troubled him for years deepened into a relentless hacking. Doctors recognized the signs of tuberculosis, the slow and merciless disease that consumed the lungs. In an age before antibiotics, its progress was inexorable. His frame wasted away, his cheeks hollowed, and his once erect soldier's posture gave way to frailty. Each breath became a labor, accompanied by the rattling sound of fluid collecting in his chest. Friends who visited in those final months were startled by the change. The man who had once cut a figure of elegance at diplomatic courts now lay gaunt and exhausted, confined mostly to bed. He moved only with assistance, often sitting propped upright to ease his breathing. Even conversation left him drained. Still, Monroe remained dignified. He dressed neatly when able, his manners never faltering, as though determined to maintain the bearing of a president even as illness stripped him of strength. As spring turned to summer in 1831, his condition worsened. Physicians bled him, dosed him with laudanum, and prescribed rest, but nothing slowed the advance of the disease. By late June, his family knew that he was dying. His cough left him weak and blood-stained, his voice reduced to a whisper. He spoke little of politics or his legacy, instead turning his thoughts toward faith and family. The first days of July brought a cruel irony. Across New York City, preparations filled the air for the annual celebration of Independence Day. Flags were unfurled, cannon crews readied their charges, and speeches were written to honor the nation's birth. Monroe could hear the distant sounds of a country preparing to celebrate the Declaration of Independence, a document he had helped defend as a young soldier in 1776. On the morning of July 4th, Monroe slipped further into delirium. His family gathered close, aware of the strange symmetry. Two former presidents, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, had both died on the very same day 5 years earlier, on the 50th anniversary of independence. Now, as the Republic prepared to mark its 55th year, it seemed another of its leaders might follow. By afternoon, Monroe's breathing grew shallow. His pulse faltered. At around 3:15 p.m., as bells rang and cannon fire echoed across the city in celebration, James Monroe exhaled one last time. He was gone. The coincidence was undeniable. 3 presidents, all signers or defenders of independence, had now died on the 4th of July. Americans who heard the news described it not as chance, but as providence, as if divine design had chosen to bind the nation's founders to its birthday. News of Monroe's death spread quickly. In New York, the festivities gave way to mourning. The booming cannons that had thundered in celebration seemed now like salutes to the fallen statesman. Newspapers carried the story in solemn tones, marveling at the extraordinary coincidence of his passing. Many saw it as a sign that the revolutionary generation was truly fading into history. Monroe's body was laid out in New York, where thousands came to pay their respects. He had died nearly penniless, his fortunes drained by years of public service and debt, yet the public memory of him remained tied to strength and principle. In time, his remains would be reinterred in Virginia, resting near the soil where his story had begun. His death was remembered less for drama than for timing. Unlike Washington, who died suddenly, or Jefferson and Adams, whose words carried a poetic finality, Monroe's end was quieter, consumed by disease. But because it fell on Independence Day, his death carried an aura of symbolism that lifted it beyond the personal. To many, it seemed that America itself had marked the date by claiming another of its founders. The coincidence would be repeated only once more, with Calvin Coolidge's birth on July 4, 1872. But for most Americans, the clustering of deaths Jefferson, Adams, and Monroe gave the date a sacred weight, a sense that Providence itself had entwined the fates of its presidents with the birth of the Republic. Thus, in a borrowed New York home, far from the fields where he had once stood as a soldier of liberty, James Monroe closed his eyes on the 4th of July, 1831. The statesman who had declared America's hemisphere free from European dominion departed on the very day the nation had declared itself free from Europe's empire. His legacy, though overshadowed in later years, remained bound to the Republic's destiny, and his death became part of its myth. John Quincy Adams, 1767 to 1848. John Quincy Adams had been born into a revolution. He was the son of John Adams, the second president, and as a boy, he had stood on the shore at Braintree, Massachusetts, watching musket smoke rise from the Battle of Bunker Hill. He would live for 8 decades, serve as the 6th president of the United States, and, when his single term ended, return not to retirement, but to the halls of Congress. John Quincy Adams was perhaps the only president who seemed most alive after leaving the presidency. By the late 1840s, he was an old man, 70 years past, with a frame bent by years of toil, but a mind as sharp as ever. In Washington, he became known as the Old Man Eloquent, the relentless voice against slavery in the House of Representatives. His speeches defied the gag rule that sought to silence debate on abolition. He fought, with every ounce of his remaining strength, to keep the Republic true to the ideals it had proclaimed in 1776. But his body could not match the endurance of his will. For years, he had endured fainting spells and bouts of exhaustion. Friends noticed how he leaned more heavily on his cane, how he sometimes faltered on the House floor. Still, he refused to stop. Adams believed his duty lay not in comfort, but in service, and so he carried on, even as his heart strained under the weight of years. On February 21, 1848, the House of Representatives convened as usual. The chamber was filled with the murmur of debate, the scratching of quills, and the shuffle of papers. Adams, seated at his desk, rose to speak against an issue he had opposed consistently: the Mexican-American War. To him, it was a war of aggression, fought to extend the reach of slavery. His voice, though frail, still carried conviction. But as he rose, his body betrayed him. Witnesses recalled the moment. Adams clutched his chest, staggered, and collapsed across his desk. Papers scattered to the floor. Members rushed forward as the chamber erupted in confusion. Some feared he was already dead. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke. Quickly, colleagues lifted him from the House floor and carried him into the Speaker's room, a chamber just off the main hall. There, they laid him upon a sofa, his body motionless. For 2 days, he lingered in that room, attended by physicians, family, and members of Congress who came to pay respects. His wife, Louisa, was summoned, though she was frail herself and could not bear the journey from their home. His son, Charles Francis Adams, came to his bedside. During those last hours, Adams drifted in and out of consciousness. He could not move, and his words came with difficulty, but his mind was not entirely gone. At one point, he whispered the words that would be remembered as his last. "This is the last of earth. I am content." To some, they carried resignation. To others, a sense of peace. On February 23rd, as the winter light faded over Washington, John Quincy Adams breathed his final breath. He was 80 years old. He had died in the Capitol itself, the only president to collapse and perish within the building that symbolized the nation's government. It was a fitting end for a man whose entire life had been bound to the service of the Republic. News of his death spread quickly. Across the country, newspapers mourned him not simply as a former president, but as a statesman who had never ceased to serve. Unlike his father, who had died at home, John Quincy Adams died with his boots on in the arena of politics. The symbolism was unmistakable. His life had ended in the very place where he had fought so fiercely to defend liberty. In Washington, his body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Thousands filed past to pay their respects, among them congressmen, cabinet officials, and ordinary citizens. The press described scenes of solemn mourning, the hush of crowds as they gazed upon his coffin draped in black. From there, his remains were carried north to Massachusetts. The journey itself became a funeral procession, with stops along the way where citizens gathered to honor him. In Quincy, he was buried in the family tomb alongside his father and mother, and in time, his wife, Lois, would join them. It became the resting place of two presidents, father and son, whose lives had been so deeply entwined with the nation's beginnings. For Americans in 1848, Adams' death was more than the loss of an elder statesman. It was the fading of a generation that had witnessed the birth of the United States. He had been the last living link to the revolution, still serving in national office. His voice, once thundering against tyranny abroad and injustice at home, was silenced at last. But the manner of his death, collapsing in the Capitol, defiant to the end, ensured that his memory endured not merely as a president, but as a fighter who would not abandon the struggle. Historians have often judged Adams' presidency as difficult and unremarkable, but his post-presidential career gave him a second life in history. He had opposed the annexation of Texas, spoken against the expansion of slavery, and argued before the Supreme Court on behalf of the Amistad captives. These battles had made him a hero to the growing abolitionist movement, even if they exhausted his frail body. When he died, one congressman remarked that it was as though he had fallen at the post of duty, like a soldier on the battlefield. And so it was remembered. His death inside the Capitol became part of the building's mythology, a reminder that the Republic's defenders sometimes gave not only their labor, but their very lives upon its floor. Thus, John Quincy Adams, son of a president, himself a president, but more than either a lifelong servant of the Republic, ended his days as he had lived them, in public duty, unwilling to yield until at last his failing body forced him to silence. Andrew Jackson, 1767 to 1845. Few American presidents embodied the raw force of will like Andrew Jackson. Born in the Carolina backcountry in 1767, orphaned young, he clawed his way upward through sheer resilience. He was scarred by war, carried bullets lodged in his flesh, and cultivated the image of a man who could never be broken. To his admirers, he was the defender of the common man. To his critics, a dangerous demagogue. But in his last years, the iron that had carried him through battles and presidencies slowly rusted away under the relentless toll of disease. By the 1840s, Jackson had retreated to the Hermitage, his plantation near Nashville. He had long since left public office, but his influence lingered. Visitors often described him as frail, yet his presence remained commanding. His hair, once auburn, had turned white, his frame gaunt, his voice cracked but sharp. He lived in constant pain. Jackson's body bore the consequences of a life of violence and hardship. He carried 2 bullets in him to the end, one from a duel, another from the War of 1812. They had festered for years, poisoning his blood. His lungs were ravaged by chronic infections. He coughed incessantly, spitting blood at times, his breath short and wheezing. Dropsy, what we now call congestive heart failure, swelled his legs and stomach with fluid, forcing him to sit upright at night to breathe. Rheumatism gnawed at his joints, leaving him stiff and aching. He was a man who had once stood unyielding on the battlefield, now trapped inside a body that betrayed him. Despite his failing health, Jackson remained defiant. He continued to receive visitors at the Hermitage, hosting politicians, admirers, and old comrades in arms. To each, he presented himself as vigorous as possible, even when exhaustion forced him to collapse afterward. Religion became his solace. In his final years, he turned more openly to faith, speaking of heaven, forgiveness, and reunion with loved ones. He often said he longed to see his wife, Rachel, who had died in 1828, just before his inauguration, a loss he had never ceased to grieve. The spring of 1845 brought no relief. His body swelled with fluid, his breathing grew labored, and his physicians could do little but ease his discomfort. On June 8th, at the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's long struggle reached its end. Surrounded by family and servants, he drifted in and out of consciousness. At times, he rallied, speaking with the fierce clarity that had once intimidated his opponents. At others, his voice faded into whispers. According to witnesses, he spent his final hours speaking of faith. He declared himself ready to die, confident in salvation. He gathered his family and household slaves around his bed, urging them to meet him in heaven. It was a striking scene. The old general, who had commanded armies and ruled a nation with fiery will, reduced to a fragile figure in a bed, yet still issuing words with the weight of command. Shortly after 6 o'clock in the evening, Andrew Jackson's breathing slowed. His chest rose and fell one last time, and then he was gone. He was 78 years old. The man who had survived duels, bullets, wars, and the fury of politics had finally succumbed, not to an enemy's sword, but to the steady erosion of his own body. The news of his death spread quickly across the United States. To his supporters, he was remembered as a hero of New Orleans, the soldier president who had defended the Union against its enemies. To his detractors, he remained a divisive figure, the architect of Indian removal and a man whose force of personality had pushed the presidency toward authoritarian power. But in death, as in life, Andrew Jackson commanded attention. At the Hermitage, thousands gathered for his funeral. The house and grounds were filled with mourners. Black crepe draped over windows and doorways. Ministers spoke of his faith, his service, and his indomitable character. Soldiers fired volleys into the air. Neighbors and strangers alike filed past his coffin, some weeping openly, others standing in stoic silence. He was laid to rest in the garden beside Rachel, beneath a domed tomb he had built years earlier. Visitors noted how the old general had always spoken of her, even decades after her passing. In death, he returned to her side. The symbolism of Jackson's passing was not lost on Americans in 1845. He had been the first president truly born on the frontier, the first to embody the restless energy of the expanding republic. His presidency had reshaped the office, for good or ill, into a stronger, more personal force. His death marked the end of an era, the fading of a generation of men who had lived through the Revolution and carved a new nation from wilderness and war. For those who knew him, the memory of his last days lingered. Even as his body failed, his spirit had remained unbowed. He had faced death much as he had faced life, directly, without apology, unafraid. One observer wrote that Jackson died as he had lived, a soldier of iron will, but a Christian reconciled to his fate. Thus, Andrew Jackson, orphan, general, and president, ended his life at the Hermitage, the plantation he had built with his own hands, surrounded by family, followers, and the memory of his beloved Rachel. His body was broken, his flesh worn thin by violence and disease, but his presence endured in the republic he had helped to shape. And though his legacy would remain contested, his departure left an unmistakable void in the American story. Martin Van Buren, 1782 to 1862. Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, was the first to be born after the Revolution, a child not of colonies, but of a nation. A master of politics, he rose from modest beginnings in Kinderhook, New York, to the highest office in the land. His presidency was scarred by economic depression, but his skill as a strategist kept him influential for decades. By the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, Van Buren was one of the last living links to the age of Andrew Jackson and the early republic. Yet even he, the little magician of politics, could not conjure an escape from the creeping decay of the body. Van Buren lived much of his later life in quiet retirement at Lindenwold, his estate near Kinderhook. He enjoyed long walks, receiving visitors, and writing letters. His neighbors described him as courtly, reserved, and dignified. But as the years passed, age slowly pressed down upon him. His once fiery red hair turned silver, his steps shortened, and illness began to weigh heavily. By the early 1860s, Van Buren's health had sharply declined. He suffered from asthma, which left him short of breath and dependent on the summer air to ease his lungs. At times, he struggled with heart trouble, which weakened him further. Dropsy swelling caused by heart failure began to fill his body with fluid. His legs thickened, his face puffed, and the effort of climbing stairs became nearly impossible. Servants and family members recalled that he tried to mask his suffering with politeness, rarely complaining, but his labored breathing told the story plainly. The final decline came in 1862, as America was being torn apart by civil war. Van Buren, though no longer active in politics, followed events with sorrow. He had once been a champion of union and compromise, but now he watched helplessly as the nation dissolved into bloodshed. Neighbors remarked that his spirit seemed heavy, as if the war itself had drained his will. That spring, his health worsened beyond recovery. Asthma attacks left him gasping for air. His body swelled painfully with fluid, and his doctors could offer little but laudanum and rest. In July, confined to his bed at Lindenwold, he became weaker each day. His family gathered close, watching the once great statesman fade. Van Buren remained lucid through much of his final illness. He spoke with his sons and grandchildren, reflecting on politics, family, and faith. He expressed resignation at death's approach. To his household, he was gentle, often thanking them for small kindnesses, a courtesy he maintained until the end. Unlike some presidents who had raged against their fate, Van Buren seemed to accept his, drifting into silence as if closing a long chapter. On the morning of July 24, 1862, Martin Van Buren's struggle ended. In the bedchamber of Lindenwold, with his family at his side, he breathed his last. He was 80 years old. The final cause was recorded as asthma and heart failure, a slow suffocation, the body drowning in its own fluid. His death passed almost quietly in comparison to others, yet its timing gave it weight. The Union itself was collapsing, and one of its elder guardians had departed. Newspapers noted the symbolism. The New York Herald reported, "Another of the revolutionary generation has gone down to the grave," even though Van Buren had been born just after independence. To many, his passing signaled the closing of an age of politics where compromise had been possible before the nation fractured beyond repair. Funeral services were held in Kinderhook. The procession wound through the village streets, where Van Buren had been born, raised, and now returned in death. Bells tolled as mourners followed his coffin, draped in black, to the local Dutch Reformed church. The ceremony was simple but dignified, fitting for a man known more for quiet cunning than fiery rhetoric. Ministers spoke of his public service, his devotion to his state and country, and his careful stewardship of friendships and alliances. Van Buren was buried in the Kinderhook Reformed Cemetery, among his kin, beneath a simple monument. Visitors noted the modesty of the grave. No grand marble, no towering statue, only a stone marking the resting place of a man who had shaped the Democratic Party and once held the presidency. His grave overlooked the fields and village he had known as a boy, a reminder that even the architect of politics must finally return to the soil from which he came. His death did not pass unnoticed in Washington. Though the Civil War consumed headlines, newspapers across the North published reflections on his long career. They spoke of his skill as a political organizer, his years beside Andrew Jackson, and his struggles as president during the Panic of 1837. Some criticized his cautiousness, others praised his wisdom, but nearly all noted that with his passing, America lost one more voice of an older generation, one that had built the institutions now straining under the weight of civil war. For his neighbors in Kinderhook, however, his death was not the fall of a politician but the loss of a neighbor, a man who walked their roads, spoke with their children, and treated them with courtesy. To them, the little magician had become simply Mr. Van Buren, a familiar figure who had lived among them until the very end. In his final years, Van Buren had lived surrounded by reminders of the world he once commanded, letters from presidents, visitors from Washington, portraits of Jackson and Jefferson. But on his deathbed, all that faded. He left this world not in the halls of power, but in the quiet of Lindenwold, attended not by senators, but by his children and servants. His end was not dramatic, but ordinary, a slow dimming of the breath until it was gone. Thus, Martin Van Buren's story closed not with war or duel, not with assassination or dramatic last words, but with the soft surrender of a man who had outlived his time. He was the first president truly born American and the last of his generation to die before the Civil War's end. His death, quiet though it was, marked the vanishing of a political world that could no longer exist. William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841. In 1841, William Henry Harrison stood before the American people as their newly elected president. At 68 years old, he was the oldest man to assume the office at the time. A veteran of the frontier wars, the hero of Tippecanoe, and a seasoned territorial governor, Harrison presented himself as a man of the people, humble, tough, forged by wilderness and war. His inauguration on March 4th would become infamous, not for its grandeur, but for what followed. The day was bitterly cold and wet. A raw wind swept through Washington, and drizzle hung in the air. Harrison, eager to project vigor and endurance, refused both a coat and a hat. He rode on horseback in the procession and stood in the chill air for nearly 2 hours as he delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, more than 8,000 words. His voice strained, his body shivered, but he carried on, determined to present the image of rugged strength. Soon after, Harrison fell ill. At first, it seemed minor, a cough, some fatigue. But the sickness deepened quickly. By March 26th, he was bedridden in the White House, suffering chills, high fever, and chest pains. His physicians diagnosed pleurisy, then pneumonia. The medical treatments of the time, however, only worsened his condition. Doctors applied mustard poultices, bled him of blood, gave him opium and castor oil, and administered calomel, a mercury-based purgative that poisoned as much as it cured. Harrison, already weakened by exhaustion, deteriorated rapidly. Visitors described the president gasping for breath, alternating between restless delirium and long spells of silence. His attendants tried to shield his suffering from the public, but rumors spread quickly. Less than a month into his presidency, the nation was already holding its breath. On April 4th, Harrison's body could endure no more. After days of fever and agony, his breathing grew shallow. Surrounded by doctors and a few members of his household, he drifted into unconsciousness. Moments before the end, he stirred and whispered words later reported as a message meant for his successor, John Tyler. "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish they would carry it out. I ask nothing more." At midnight, William Henry Harrison was dead. He had served just 31 days, the shortest presidency in American history. The shock was immense. No president had died in office before. The Constitution did not clearly specify what should happen. Would Vice President Tyler become president outright, or merely act as president until another could be chosen? For days, the nation debated. Tyler insisted that he was president in full, setting the precedent for all future successions. But the uncertainty revealed how fragile the young republic's institutions still were. News of Harrison's death spread across the country by telegraph and newspaper. In towns and cities, church bells tolled, black crepe was hung, and citizens gathered for memorial services. In Washington, his body was placed in the East Room of the White House, the first to be used for a presidential funeral. Thousands passed by the coffin, weeping and silent. On April 7th, a funeral procession wound through the streets of the Capitol. Soldiers in uniform marched, bands played dirges, and carriages carried mourners draped in black. Harrison's coffin, adorned with flags and flowers, was borne on a black-draped hearse. Crowds lined the avenues, some openly sobbing. The spectacle was unprecedented, for never before had the Republic buried a sitting president. After the ceremonies in Washington, Harrison's remains were carried back to his home state of Ohio. Along the way, communities gathered to pay tribute. In Cincinnati and other towns, citizens turned out by the thousands. Farmers, veterans, and laborers who had supported his log cabin and hard cider campaign mourned their fallen leader. When his body finally reached North Bend, Ohio, he was laid to rest on a hill overlooking the Ohio River at the family estate. Harrison's death left the nation uneasy. He had campaigned as a figure of simplicity, yet his passing was tangled in symbolism. The frontier general who had promised to serve the people had barely begun before the grave claimed him. His death forced the nation to consider the fragility of life at the highest office and the uncertainty of leadership. Newspapers reflected on the irony. The oldest president ever inaugurated, whose strength had been emphasized at every turn, cut down by the elements in a matter of weeks. The political consequences were profound. His death elevated John Tyler, a man never intended by his party to wield such power, to the presidency. Tyler's independence would fracture the Whig Party and reshape politics in ways no one had foreseen. Thus, Harrison's passing was not only a personal tragedy, but a turning point in the story of American governance. For his family, the grief was intimate. Harrison left behind Anna, his wife of more than 40 years, who had been too ill to travel to Washington for his inauguration and would never see him as president. Their 10 children and numerous grandchildren mourned not only a public figure, but a husband, father, and patriarch. His estate at North Bend became both a shrine and a reminder of how suddenly life could change. Historians later debated whether his illness truly came from exposure during the inauguration or whether it was a coincidence. Some argued that contaminated water at the White House may have contributed. But whatever the cause, the symbolism remained. The great speech in the cold rain, the swift decline, and the coffin borne home in black. In death, William Henry Harrison was remembered less for his presidency, too brief to leave a mark, and more for the manner of his departure. He became a symbol of mortality in high office, the reminder that even the most exalted station cannot shield a man from fate. Thus ended the life of the nation's ninth president, a general of the frontier, raised on war and politics, who reached the pinnacle only to be struck down almost at once. His grave above the Ohio River still looks westward, toward the frontier he had once fought to shape. And though his presidency lasted but a month, his death carved a lasting precedent that the republic must carry on, even when its leader falls suddenly into silence. John Tyler, 1790 to 1862. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, lived long enough to see his country fracture into war. He had once been a reluctant Whig, then his accidency, the first man to ascend to the presidency after the death of another. By 1861, he was an old man in Virginia, 70 years of age, watching the Union he had once governed tear itself apart. And when death finally came for him in January 1862, it left a legacy like no other president before him. He would be buried under the flag of rebellion, ignored by the government he had once led. Tyler had always been frail in body, though iron in opinion. In his youth, he suffered from dysentery and a lifelong tendency toward bronchial illness. By the time of the Civil War, decades of stress, tobacco, and infirmity had worn his body down. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on canes, and often struggled to breathe. Yet even in his twilight, his mind remained sharp. He opposed secession at first, but when Virginia joined the Confederacy in 1861, Tyler cast his lot with his state. He was even elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, set to take his seat in Richmond, but he would never live to serve it. In the winter of 1862, Tyler's health collapsed. He had suffered minor strokes in previous years, each leaving him weaker. By January, his lungs filled with congestion, his heart faltered, and he took to his bed in Richmond. Friends described him as restless at night, coughing constantly, rising to sit upright in hopes of catching breath. Physicians attended him, but the medicine of the day could do little. On January 17th, while sitting at the dinner table with his family, Tyler suddenly felt dizzy. He grasped his head, complaining of chills and weakness, then was carried to his bed. By nightfall, he was slipping in and out of consciousness. His pulse grew irregular, his speech faint. His family gathered at his bedside as he labored for breath. Shortly after midnight on January 18th, John Tyler died in his sleep. He was 71 years old. The cause was recorded as a stroke, likely compounded by bronchial illness and heart disease. The aftermath of his death was unlike that of any other president. In Washington, the Lincoln administration gave no official recognition. Tyler had not only abandoned the Union, but actively joined its enemy. For the first time in American history, a former president was denied national mourning. No flags were lowered in his honor. No resolutions of sorrow passed in Congress. In the eyes of the United States government, John Tyler had ceased to exist. In Richmond, however, the Confederate government gave him the honors the Union withheld. His coffin was draped not with the stars and stripes, but with the Confederate flag. Cannons boomed in salute, soldiers paraded, and Jefferson Davis himself paid tribute. His body lay in state in the Confederate capital, the only American president ever so honored by a government in rebellion against the Union. The funeral procession through Richmond was solemn. Thousands lined the streets as Tyler's coffin, borne on a hearse, rolled past. Women wore black veils, soldiers removed their hats, and Confederate bands played slow dirges. He was interred at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, beside the James River, among soldiers and statesmen of the Confederacy. His grave would later share company with Jefferson Davis himself. For his family, the grief was complicated by politics. His children he fathered over the course of his life, more than any other president, were divided between North and South. Some remained loyal to the Union, others served the Confederacy. In death, Tyler embodied the same division that had torn apart the Republic. Historians would later debate his legacy. Some saw him as principled, a man who followed his state above all else. Others condemned him as a traitor, the only president to turn against the Union he once swore to defend. His death in Confederate Richmond froze his reputation, leaving him an outlier among American leaders. Even his epitaph reflected the ambiguity. His grave marker bore his name and dates, but made no mention of the presidency of the United States. Only later would a more elaborate monument be erected, acknowledging him as a president, yet still standing in the soil of the old Confederacy. Tyler's death was a reminder of the strange course of American history. He had once been at the center of a constitutional crisis, establishing that a vice president who succeeds a fallen leader becomes president in full, not in title alone. Yet 2 decades later, he would end his life outside the Union entirely, his coffin wrapped in the banner of secession. No other president before or since has died in open defiance of the country he once led. His end remains unique, unsettling, and unresolved. A man who began by defending the Constitution and finished by rejecting it. Thus passed John Tyler, the 10th president. He left no national mourning, no congressional resolutions, no flags at half-mast. Only the echo of cannon fire in Confederate Richmond and the uneasy silence of Washington, unwilling to claim him in death. His grave on the banks of the James River is quiet now, but the memory of his passing lingers as a strange chapter in the nation's history, a president who died not as an American, but as a Confederate. James K. Polk, 1795 to 1849. James K. Polk was only 53 when he left the White House in March of 1849, but he carried the weight of a much older man. Few presidents had worked harder. During his single term, he had expanded the nation's borders to the Pacific, overseen the annexation of Texas, settled the Oregon boundary, and presided over victory in the Mexican-American War. The United States was larger, stronger, and more secure than when he had entered office. Yet the triumph came at a terrible personal cost. Polk drove himself relentlessly. He rarely delegated, sleeping little, reading every letter, revising every speech. His thin frame, already fragile, wasted away under the burden. By the end of his term, his face was gaunt, his body exhausted, his health broken. He confided to friends that he felt like an old man, though he was still in his early 50s. His wife, Sarah Childress Polk, watched with growing concern. When he left Washington, Polk intended to retire quietly. He had promised from the start to serve only one term. In May 1849, he and Sarah traveled south toward their home in Tennessee. Along the way, they stopped in New Orleans. But the city was in the grip of a deadly cholera epidemic. The disease struck quickly, spreading through contaminated water, killing thousands. Polk may have contracted the infection there, though he showed no symptoms at first. When he reached Nashville in late May, he seemed eager to settle into private life. He purchased a home he named Polk Place, a dignified residence in the city. He spoke of resting, writing his memoirs, and living in peace with Sarah after years of toil. But his body would not allow it. Within days, he fell ill. At first, it seemed a minor stomach upset. Then came fever, nausea, and violent diarrhea, the unmistakable signs of cholera. Physicians were called, but there was little they could do. Remedies included laudanum, calomel, and stimulants, but none halted the disease. Polk grew weaker by the day. His decline was swift and agonizing. Friends described him as restless, unable to sleep, racked with pain. His face grew hollow, his lips dry, his skin pale. His attendants kept vigil as the president, once so commanding in public, lay broken in private. Sarah remained at his side throughout, refusing to leave him even for an hour. She bathed his forehead, read to him from scripture, and tried to soothe his suffering. Polk, knowing his time was short, summoned strength enough to make his final arrangements. He signed his will, designating Sarah as his sole heir. He called in clergymen, confessing his sins and seeking the rights of the Methodist Church. Only weeks earlier, he had undergone a formal conversion, perhaps sensing the shadow already falling upon him. By mid-June, Polk was visibly failing. His voice weakened, his breathing shallow. Those who saw him remarked how much he had aged in a matter of days, as if the office had drained his last reserves of life. On June 15, 1849, just 3 months after leaving the presidency, James K. Polk died at his home in Nashville. He was the youngest president ever to die after leaving office, only 53. His last words were not recorded, but his actions spoke clearly. He had lived for duty, and in the end, duty had consumed him. His death stunned the nation. The newspapers that had once debated his policies now mourned the man himself. They noted the cruel irony that the president who had expanded the country so dramatically lived barely long enough to see it. Funeral ceremonies were held in Nashville. The city's streets were filled with mourners, and his coffin was carried to the state capitol grounds, where he was first interred. Sarah, veiled in black, walked behind, her grief apparent to all. Ministers spoke of his devotion to the Union, his industry, and his faith. Later, his body was moved to the grounds of Polk Place, where a tomb was built. For decades, Sarah lived there in widowhood, tending his memory. She never remarried, living another 42 years, becoming known as the First Lady in Black. She guarded Polk's legacy with fierce devotion, preserving his papers and protecting his reputation. Polk's death became a symbol of both the burden and brevity of power. In a single term, he had achieved his ambitions, the continental expansion of the United States. But it had cost him his life. No president before him had burned so brightly and faded so quickly. Historians later described him as a workaholic president, a man whose relentless drive pushed the boundaries of the republic but left little space for his own survival. His expansion of American territory sowed seeds of division that would later bloom into civil war. Yet in 1849, all that mattered was that a man, still young by presidential standards, had been carried off by disease. His epitaph could have been written in his own words. At the close of his term, he declared, "No president who performs his duty faithfully and conscientiously can have any leisure." He was right. And in Polk's case, duty left no time for rest at all. Today, his tomb still stands in Nashville, though his remains were later moved to the grounds of the Tennessee state capitol. There, amid the bustle of the city, lies the man who carried the United States to the Pacific and then, drained by labor and disease, passed into history within a single season of leaving office. Zachary Taylor, 1784 to 1850. Zachary Taylor's rise to the presidency was as unlikely as his death was sudden. A lifelong soldier, he had spent 40 years in the army, fighting in frontier wars, the War of 1812, and most famously in the Mexican-American War. The victories at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Buena Vista made him a national hero, a simple man of plain speech and rough manners elevated by the adoration of the public. They called him Old Rough and Ready. He had no great political ambition, no long career in public office. Yet in 1848, riding a wave of popularity, he was elected 12th President of the United States. By the summer of 1850, Taylor had been in office just 16 months. Washington was sweltering in July. The heat clung to the city, and the president's health, though generally robust, was not invulnerable. He had endured decades of exposure in the field, from malarial swamps to scorching deserts. But the capital brought its own hazards of sanitation, tainted water, and the constant spread of disease in the humid air. On July 4, 1850, Taylor attended Independence Day ceremonies at the unfinished Washington Monument. Accounts suggest that he stood in the oppressive sun, listening to speeches that dragged on for hours. By the time he returned to the White House, he was overheated, exhausted, and thirsty. Seeking refreshment, he reportedly consumed large quantities of raw cherries, along with iced milk and cold water, a combination that would later become the stuff of grim legend. That evening, he began to feel ill. At first, it seemed like stomach upset, but the symptoms quickly worsened. Violent cramps, severe diarrhea, nausea, and fever racked him. Physicians were called to his bedside. They diagnosed cholera morbus, a catch-all term at the time for acute gastrointestinal illness, likely caused by food or water contaminated with bacteria. Some believed it was the tainted water of Washington, which flowed through shallow, unsanitary channels. Others suspected the cherries and milk were simply triggers that worsened the condition. For 5 days, Taylor battled the illness. The White House became a sick room. Curtains were drawn to keep out the blazing sun. Doctors administered calomel and opium, then blistering poultices and stimulant medicines as brutal as the disease itself. None brought relief. The president's body, accustomed to endurance, now betrayed him. He grew weaker by the hour. Witnesses described him lying restless, moaning in pain, drenched in sweat. His wife, Margaret Peggy Taylor, remained constantly at his side, though she was unaccustomed to Washington's public life and deeply distressed by what she saw. Cabinet members came and went in hushed tones, aware that the nation's leader was fading. On July 8th, Taylor's condition deteriorated sharply. He was lucid enough to understand his fate. He called for a clergyman, expressing his resignation. "I am about to die. I expect the summons very soon." To those gathered, he declared that he had always tried to do his duty honestly, and he was ready to meet his God. At 10:35 p.m. on July 9, 1850, Zachary Taylor died in the White House. He was 65 years old. He had been president for just 1 year and 4 months, the third shortest tenure in American history. The nation was stunned. His death came at a critical moment. The country was in the midst of a fierce sectional crisis over the expansion of slavery into new territories. Taylor, though a Southern slaveholder, had opposed secessionist threats from Southern leaders and urged compromise. His sudden death threw the balance of power into uncertainty, elevating Vice President Millard Fillmore to the presidency. Funeral ceremonies were held in Washington. Taylor's coffin, draped in black, was placed in the East Room of the White House. Thousands filed past to pay respects. Military processions accompanied him to the Congressional Cemetery, with cannons firing in salute. Later, his body was moved to his family's cemetery near Louisville, Kentucky, where it rests beneath a mausoleum. But Taylor's story did not end with his burial. In the years that followed, rumors spread that his death had not been natural. His opposition to Southern secession, his resistance to slavery's expansion would have made him a target. Whispers of poisoning circulated, fueled by the speed of his illness and the political stakes of the moment. For more than a century, the theory persisted, though historians generally dismissed it as unlikely. In 1991, his body was exhumed. Samples of hair and fingernails were tested for arsenic. The results showed only trace amounts, far below lethal levels. The evidence pointed back to natural causes of acute gastroenteritis, brought on by contaminated food or water, in an era when Washington was a breeding ground for disease. The cherries and milk remained part of the legend, but the true culprit was likely the city's unsanitary conditions. Margaret Taylor, grief-stricken, withdrew from public life. She lived quietly until her death 2 years later. Their daughter, Mary Elizabeth, who had served as White House hostess, also carried the weight of the family's loss. Zachary Taylor's presidency remains one of the great what-ifs of American history. He was a man of simple speech but firm conviction, who might have steered the Union through its sectional crisis with more independence than those who succeeded him. His sudden death left that possibility forever unanswered. For contemporaries, the shock was in its speed. A robust general, a war hero, lay low in days by something as trivial as fruit and milk. His epitaph might have been the words he himself used when asked about the presidency. "I have no ambition to govern men. It is a burden too heavy for any one man to carry. He carried it for just 16 months, and then the burden crushed him. Today, his tomb in Louisville remains a reminder of how fragile life was in the 19th century, even for a president. Disease, unsanitary water, and primitive medicine claimed lives without warning. And so old, rough, and ready, the soldier who had endured decades of war met his end not on a battlefield, but in the sick room of the White House, undone by Cherry's milk and the invisible poisons of his age. Millard Fillmore, 1800 to 1874. Millard Fillmore entered the White House not by election, but by fate. In July 1850, Zachary Taylor's sudden death elevated his vice president, a quiet lawyer from western New York, to the presidency. Fillmore had grown up in poverty, working as a cloth dresser's apprentice before teaching himself law. He was neither a commanding orator nor a charismatic figure, but diligent and cautious. His presidency from 1850 to 1853 was defined by one of the most divisive compromises in American history, the Compromise of 1850, which sought to calm tensions over slavery, but instead deepened the fractures that would later lead to civil war. When he left office, Fillmore lived nearly 21 more years long afterlife for a former president. He watched the country descend into war, saw cities burned, and witnessed Abraham Lincoln's assassination. He also remarried, outlived most of his contemporaries, and became a familiar presence in Buffalo, New York, where he built a respected though sometimes controversial reputation. But by the early 1870s, time and illness began to close in. Fillmore's later years were marked by frailty. He had always been prone to respiratory ailments, and in old age, he suffered from circulatory problems. In February 1874, at the age of 74, he suffered his first stroke. It left him weakened, though not bedridden. Friends and family noticed slurred speech, unsteady movement, and a look of weariness that never quite left him. He struggled to maintain the image of the dignified statesman, appearing at public events in Buffalo even as his body betrayed him. The first stroke was followed by a second, more severe, in early March. This time, his condition deteriorated quickly. He was confined to his bed in his home on Niagara Square. Doctors attended him daily, but 19th century medicine could offer little beyond rest and comfort. His right side was partially paralyzed. Speaking was difficult, his words slow and halting. His appetite dwindled and his strength ebbed. During his final days, his wife, Caroline Carmichael Fillmore, his second wife, whom he had married in 1858 after the death of his first, kept vigil at his side. She read to him, prayed with him, and sought to ease his suffering. Friends and civic leaders visited quietly, aware they were saying farewell to Buffalo's most distinguished citizen. Fillmore himself remained lucid enough to understand his fate. According to one account, when offered a spoonful of soup during his decline, he whispered, "The nourishment is palatable." They are said to have been his last recorded words, a quiet, almost mundane remark, characteristic of a man who had never sought drama. On the evening of March 8, 1874, Millard Fillmore died in his Buffalo home. He was 74 years old. The news was met with solemn respect across the nation. Though history would not rank him among the great presidents, his death marked the passing of another link to the antebellum era, a reminder of how far the nation had traveled since the days of compromise and sectional debate. His funeral was held in Buffalo, attended by large crowds. Schools and businesses closed in mourning. The city's streets were lined with people as his coffin was carried to Forest Lawn Cemetery. There, beneath the stillness of the trees, Fillmore was laid to rest. His grave remains one of the prominent sites in the cemetery, a place where visitors still pause to reflect on a president often overlooked. Fillmore's death drew measured tributes. Newspapers called him industrious, honest, and devoted to the Union. Yet many also noted the compromises that defined his presidency, particularly his signing of the Fugitive Slave Act, which required that escaped enslaved people be returned to their enslavers, law that outraged abolitionists and darkened his legacy. Even in death, his reputation was contested, remembered in Buffalo as a benefactor who helped found the University at Buffalo and libraries, but nationally as a man whose moderation failed to heal the country's divisions. Caroline Fillmore lived on for 7 more years, preserving her husband's memory. She ensured his home and papers remained intact, guarding his place in history, however modest. For Buffalonians, his tomb became a symbol of civic pride, even if the wider nation judged him more harshly. Millard Fillmore's death was not dramatic. No assassination, no sudden mystery, no youthful tragedy. Instead, it was the quiet decline of an old man, worn down by the slow march of time. Yet in its ordinariness lies its meaning. His passing reminded the nation that presidents, however grand their office, remain mortal, subject to the same illnesses and frailties as all men. Today, historians often rank Fillmore near the lower end of presidential evaluations, but his death, like his life, reflects the complexity of leadership in a divided nation. He lived long enough to see the consequences of compromise play out in bloodshed, and long enough to know that history's judgment might not be kind. Still, in Buffalo, his name endures, carved into institutions and landmarks, his grave visited by those curious about the 13th president man who tried to hold the Union together, and who in the end slipped away quietly in the home he had built, leaving the unfinished work of his era to others. Franklin Pierce, 1804 to 1869. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, entered the White House as a handsome, charismatic figure, but left it broken, unpopular, and already fading into obscurity. His single term, from 1853 to 1857, was marked by sectional strife, violence in Kansas, and policies that deepened the nation's divide over slavery. Yet Pierce's life outside politics was marked even more by private tragedy. By the time death came for him in 1869, he was a man hollowed by loss, his final years consumed by grief and alcohol. Pierce's decline began not after the presidency, but before it. In January 1853, just 2 months before he was inaugurated, Pierce's 11-year-old son, Benjamin, was killed in a horrific train accident as the family traveled through Massachusetts. The boy's body was mangled before his parents' eyes, and for Pierce, this final loss was crushing. He and his wife, Jane, had already buried 2 other children in infancy. Now, with Benjamin's death, every child they had brought into the world was gone. Jane Pierce retreated into deep mourning, often confined to her room, writing letters to her dead son. Franklin, who had always been prone to melancholy and drinking, turned more heavily to alcohol as his means of escape. He carried this grief into the White House, where his presidency faltered under the weight of both personal despair and political turmoil. When he left office in 1857, Pierce was only 52 years old, younger than many presidents at the end of their service. But instead of rebuilding his life, he drifted. He traveled abroad with his wife, spending time in Europe and the Bahamas, hoping the distance would heal them. It did not. Jane remained fragile, and Franklin continued to drink heavily. By the time the Civil War erupted, Pierce was politically isolated, his reputation tarnished by his support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act and his perceived Southern sympathies. His opposition to Abraham Lincoln's wartime policies further alienated him from the Union cause. In 1863, another blow fell. Jane Pierce died of tuberculosis. For Franklin, it was the last tie to his past happiness. Alone and childless, his health and spirit collapsed further. He returned to Concord, New Hampshire, living as a recluse in a large house at 14 Walnut Street. Neighbors recalled seeing him walking the streets late at night, sometimes singing to himself, often visibly intoxicated. He drank brandy by the bottle and was rarely seen in public sober. By the late 1860s, Pierce's body bore the toll of decades of drinking. His once handsome features had withered, his hair turned white, his face sallow. He developed cirrhosis of the liver, a condition so severe that his body could no longer process the alcohol that had once numbed his pain. He also suffered from chronic stomach ailments, weakness, and tremors. Friends described him as lonely but courteous, receiving visitors with flashes of his old charm, but sinking into melancholy as soon as they left. In September 1869, Pierce's health collapsed completely. He was confined to his bed in Concord, attended by a physician and cared for by servants and neighbors. The decline was agonizing. Cirrhosis brought with it jaundice, swelling of the abdomen, bleeding, and delirium. He slipped in and out of consciousness, sometimes raving, sometimes silent. There were moments of clarity when he reportedly spoke of his wife and children as though seeing them again. On the morning of October 8, 1869, Franklin Pierce died at the age of 64. His death was neither peaceful nor swift, but a long unraveling, the final act of a man who had endured more than his share of sorrow. The reaction was subdued. Newspapers noted his passing, but few tributes were glowing. To many Americans, Pierce was already a forgotten figure, a president whose policies had hastened the country towards civil war. In Concord, however, his funeral was solemn and well-attended. He was buried in Old North Cemetery, not far from the graves of his wife and children. The contrast between his quiet, local mourning and the indifference of the nation spoke volumes about how far his star had fallen. In the decades since, Franklin Pierce has remained among the least celebrated presidents. His administration is remembered for its failures, and his personal story is overshadowed by sorrow and decline. Yet his death tells us something deeper: the crushing weight of private grief, the inability of power to shield a man from loss, and the destructive comfort of drink. Pierce's last years, spent wandering the streets of Concord in the shadow of his memories, make him one of the most tragic figures to hold the presidency. His death, at 64, was not only the end of a man, but the close of a life spent in mourning reminder that even the nation's highest office cannot protect one from despair. Today, his grave remains in Concord, simple and unadorned compared to others. Visitors rarely linger long. Yet for those who pause, the story it tells is unmistakable, of a man who had the presidency, but lost everything else, and who finally surrendered to the slow death of sorrow and the bottle. James Buchanan, 1791 to 1868. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, entered office in 1857 with long experience in politics and diplomacy. He had served as a senator, a minister to Britain, and Secretary of State. Yet, by the time of his death in 1868, his reputation was already cemented in infamy. He was the president who stood by as the nation fractured, whose inaction allowed secession to gather force. When the Civil War broke out, many considered him guilty of cowardice and failure. In life, he was scorned. In death, he received little redemption. Buchanan's personal life had always been unusual. He was the only American president to remain unmarried. His fiancée, Ann Coleman, had died suddenly in 1819, and Buchanan never married again. For decades, he lived quietly with his niece, Harriet Lane, who acted as his social hostess during his presidency. Buchanan devoted himself to public service, but his private world was marked by solitude and, in his later years, by regret. When he left the White House in March 1861, the country was already unraveling. 7 southern states had seceded, and Abraham Lincoln inherited a nation on the brink of war. Buchanan retired to his estate, Wheatland, near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There he lived as a private citizen, attempting to defend his record. He wrote a lengthy memoir, Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of Rebellion, published in 1866, in which he insisted that secession had been unconstitutional but that he lacked the authority to prevent it. Few were persuaded. His reputation as one of America's weakest presidents only grew. In these years after the presidency, Buchanan's health began to decline. He was already in his 70s, and his once robust frame thinned under the weight of chronic ailments. He suffered from rheumatic gout, a painful inflammatory disease that left his joints swollen and stiff. At times, it confined him to his chair or bed, making walking difficult. He also endured chronic respiratory troubles, likely bronchitis and pneumonia, which plagued him in the damp Pennsylvania climate. By the spring of 1868, Buchanan's strength was failing rapidly. His digestive system grew weak, and his body was racked by fever and coughing fits. Friends noted that his face grew drawn and pale, his energy reduced to brief conversations before exhaustion set in. He continued to receive visitors, including old political allies and clergymen, but increasingly his time was spent in the quiet of Wheatland, tended by servants and doctors. On May 29, 1868, Buchanan suffered what was described as a severe respiratory infection, compounded by gout and heart weakness. He was confined to bed. Over the next 3 days, his decline accelerated. He was at times delirious, at times lucid, but he knew his end was near. Clergy were called to his side, and prayers were said in the room as his breathing grew ragged. James Buchanan died on the morning of June 1, 1868, at Wheatland. He was 77 years old. The cause was recorded as respiratory failure, brought on by rheumatic gout and old age. His passing was not violent or sudden, but the quiet extinguishing of a life marked by both long service and lasting disgrace. The reaction to his death was restrained. Newspapers carried notices, but there was no outpouring of grief. The Civil War was only 3 years past, and Buchanan's reputation as the man who had failed to prevent it still clung to him. Many remembered him as the president who watched passively as the Union cracked apart, whose timidity allowed Southern leaders to arm themselves without consequence. His funeral, held in Lancaster, was dignified but modest. Thousands attended, including townspeople, veterans, and former colleagues, but it was far from a state occasion. Buchanan was buried at Woodward Hill Cemetery, in a grave he had selected himself. His epitaph was carefully chosen. Here rest the remains of James Buchanan, 15th President of the United States. Born in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, April 23, 1791. Died at Wheatland, June 1, 1868. It bore no hint of his controversies, only the plain facts of his life. In the years since, Buchanan has consistently ranked among America's least respected presidents. His failure to confront secession left the greatest trial of the nation to his successor, Abraham Lincoln. Death did little to soften this judgment. His story became a cautionary tale of how inaction can be as dangerous as misrule. And yet, looking at his deathbed, one finds not the image of a tyrant or villain, but of an old man worn down by disease, clinging to his justifications and seeking peace in his final hours. His death was quiet, but his legacy was not. The Union had already endured its bloodiest war, and history had passed harsh judgment on the man who had preceded it. James Buchanan died at Wheatland not as a revered elder statesman, but as a reminder of how history can weigh heavier than any illness. His body was lowered into Pennsylvania soil, but his name remained tied to the nation's darkest chapter legacy of paralysis at the edge of catastrophe. Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, entered Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., to watch a light-hearted comedy, Our American Cousin. The Civil War, after 4 years of carnage, was effectively over. Just 5 days earlier, Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. For the first time in his presidency, Lincoln could glimpse peace. He was weary, aged beyond his 56 years, yet hopeful that the Union might heal. What he could not know was that the war's last act would be written in his own blood. Lincoln had long lived under threat. He was hated in the South and distrusted by radicals in the North. Letters filled with menace poured into the White House, but he rarely took precautions. His tall, gaunt figure was known to all, his movements in the Capitol easily tracked. On that April night, he insisted on going to the theater despite warnings. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, accompanied him, along with Major Henry Rathbone and Rathbone's fiancée, Clara Harris. The presidential box was decorated with flags, a symbol of victory and unity, though one of them, a portrait of George Washington, would soon be stained with blood. In the crowd lurked John Wilkes Booth, a 26-year-old actor, Confederate sympathizer, and fervent believer in white supremacy. For months, he had plotted to kidnap Lincoln, hoping to exchange him for Confederate prisoners. But with the South defeated, Booth's scheme turned to murder. That night, he slipped through the theater, past guards who had left their posts, and entered the presidential box shortly after 10 p.m. Lincoln sat in his rocking chair, leaning slightly forward, absorbed in the play. Booth approached from behind, aimed a .44 caliber Derringer pistol at the back of Lincoln's head, and fired. The shot rang out like a final cannon of the war. The bullet entered just behind Lincoln's left ear, tearing through his brain. The president slumped instantly, unconscious, his long frame collapsing in his chair. Mary screamed. Rathbone lunged at Booth, who slashed him savagely with a dagger before leaping onto the stage below, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Panic swept the theater. Soldiers and doctors rushed to the box. Lincoln was carried carefully out, blood streaming from the wound. They dared not take him to the White House. His jolting carriage ride would kill him. Instead, they carried him across the street to a modest boarding house, the Peterson House. There, in a small, cramped bedroom, they laid the dying president diagonally across a bed too short for his towering height. Through the night, physicians attended him, probing the wound with crude instruments, but knowing it was fatal. The bullet had lodged deep in his brain. He never regained consciousness. Cabinet members gathered, along with senators, generals, and officials. Mary wept in an adjoining room, inconsolable, while their young son, Tad, was shielded from the horror. In the candlelit room, men stood watch as Lincoln's labored breathing filled the silence. His face grew pale, his skin clammy. From time to time, his chest rattled with the death rattle, that unmistakable herald of the end. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, grim and unyielding, assumed control. He sent telegrams to alert the nation, ordered troops into the streets, and began hunting Booth and his conspirators. Inside the boarding house, he stood vigil, recording each stage of Lincoln's decline with a lawyer's precision. As dawn approached on April 15th, the city stirred with rumors. Crowds gathered outside the Peterson House, praying, weeping, waiting. Inside, the president's pulse weakened, his breathing slowed. At 7:22 a.m., he drew his final breath. Stanton broke the silence with words that became immortal. Now he belongs to the ages. The news spread with speed. Church bells tolled across the Capitol. People filled the streets in stunned silence. The joy of victory had turned, in an instant, to grief. The Civil War had ended, but the nation's leader, who had carried it through fire, was gone. Lincoln's body was carried back to the White House. Autopsy revealed the terrible path of the bullet lodged behind his eye. His face, usually lined with weariness, now bore the stillness of death. Embalmers prepared him for public mourning, and so began one of the greatest funerary journeys in American history. For nearly 3 weeks, Lincoln's body traveled by train from Washington to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. The route traced his rise through Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, and finally to Springfield. In every city, His coffin was placed in halls draped in black, where hundreds of thousands filed past to pay respects. Entire towns lined the tracks as the train passed, heads bowed, hats removed. His death became not only a personal tragedy, but a collective ritual, binding the North in grief and in purpose. In Springfield, on May 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery. A simple service was held, and the man who had led the Union through its darkest trial was buried among the people he had always claimed as his own. His tomb would grow into a grand monument, visited by generations. The assassination gave Lincoln an almost saintly status. In life, he had been mocked, caricatured, and opposed. In death, he became a martyr for liberty, the great emancipator whose blood sealed the nation's rebirth. His murder hardened the North's resolve during Reconstruction and deepened the bitterness between North and South. John Wilkes Booth was hunted down within 12 days, cornered in a Virginia barn, and shot dead. His fellow conspirators were hanged that summer. Yet Booth's act had already achieved something darker. It ensured that the scars of war would remain raw, that reconciliation would come slowly, if at all. Abraham Lincoln's death remains one of the most searing episodes in American history. It was not the quiet passing of an old man, but the violent end of a leader at the very moment of triumph. His life was taken in the theater of war's aftermath, his body carried across the land like a relic, his memory consecrated in grief. In the small, dim bedroom of the Peterson house, the United States lost not only a president, but its guiding hand at the moment of rebirth. The Civil War had claimed more than 600,000 lives. Lincoln's was the last, and perhaps the most transformative. Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875. When Abraham Lincoln was struck down in April 1865, the burdens of the nation fell suddenly onto the shoulders of Andrew Johnson, a man whose presidency would be marked by bitterness, conflict, and mistrust. He was a tailor's son from North Carolina who had risen from poverty to the vice presidency. Yet his time in office left scars upon the nation still healing from the Civil War. Johnson was never meant to carry the weight of Lincoln's vision, and his presidency collapsed under the strife of Reconstruction. When he left office in 1869, he departed in disgrace, the first American president to face impeachment. For the last years of his life, Johnson drifted back into political life in Tennessee. Stubborn, defiant, unwilling to fade away, he remained a sharp-tongued critic of his enemies and a defender of the South's dignity. Though he had been rejected by his own party and despised in Washington, he nursed ambitions of returning to power. In 1875, against all expectations, he succeeded in reclaiming a seat in the United States Senate. No former president had ever returned to the chamber once they had risen to the White House. For Johnson, it was a symbolic vindication that he had endured the storms of politics and outlived his enemies. But his triumph was short-lived. Johnson was 66 years old, his health weakened by years of stress and hard living. In July 1875, only months after taking office, he traveled to Carter County, Tennessee, to visit his daughter Mary Stover at her home near Elizabethton. The Appalachian hills around him, familiar from his youth, bore the quiet of summer. It was here, among family, that his final days would unfold. On the evening of July 28th, Johnson complained of dizziness and fatigue. Later that night, while visiting relatives, he collapsed suddenly, felled by a stroke. His speech was slurred, his face twisted, his body half paralyzed. Carried to a bed, he lingered in weakness, drifting in and out of awareness. Physicians were summoned, but there was little they could do. In the 19th century, strokes were beyond medical remedy. Only comfort and prayer remained. Through the night, Johnson's condition worsened. At dawn on July 29th, he suffered a second stroke. His breathing became shallow, his pulse weak. Relatives gathered around his bedside, watching as his once commanding presence shrank to silence. His daughter Mary remained at his side, as did other family members who whispered prayers. In moments of clarity, Johnson attempted to speak, but his words dissolved into murmurs. He had always been a fighter in politics, in debate, in the face of scandal, but this was a battle beyond his power. By the morning of July 31st, his strength was spent. Andrew Johnson died that day at the age of 66. There was no great throng outside his home, no vast procession like the one that had carried Lincoln to his grave. His death was quiet, provincial, almost forgotten by the nation he once led. Yet even in death, Johnson's pride was unyielding. He left instructions for his burial, desiring to be wrapped in an American flag and to have a copy of the Constitution placed beneath his head. He wanted to go to his rest not as a disgraced president, but as a patriot, a man who, however flawed, had believed in the Union. His coffin was carried back to Greenville, Tennessee, where he had begun his career as a tailor and politician. Thousands from the surrounding countryside came to pay respects. For whatever his failings in Washington, in Tennessee, he remained a familiar son. He was buried on a hill that overlooked Greenville, the Constitution beneath his head, the flag around his body. The hill would come to be called Monument Hill, crowned by a tall obelisk marking his grave. From that vantage point, one could see the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee, reminder of where Johnson had come from and what he had always claimed as home. In Washington, his passing stirred little commotion. He was remembered with controversy rather than reverence. Many still recalled his stubborn clashes with Congress, his open defiance of Reconstruction, his vetoes of civil rights legislation. To some, he had betrayed Lincoln's legacy, squandering the chance to reshape the nation. To others, he had been a defender of constitutional restraint against what he saw as radical overreach. His death, like his life, divided opinion. In retrospect, Johnson's presidency is remembered as one of the weakest and most embattled. Yet his death carried symbolic weight. He was the first president to return to the Senate, dying as he tried to reclaim his place in public life. His burial instructions revealed a man haunted by legacy, anxious to be remembered as a patriot rather than as a failed leader. The image of Andrew Johnson, lying in his Tennessee grave with the Constitution beneath his head, lingers as a strange epitaph to a turbulent life. He had risen from obscurity, survived impeachment, and outlasted some of his fiercest critics. But in the end, his name was bound to an era of discord, his presidency a cautionary tale of how leadership, when mismatched with the moment, can deepen wounds rather than heal them. The hill at Greenville remains quiet, shaded by trees, far from the capitals of power. There, the man who once held the nation's highest office rests in the soil of his home state, wrapped in the symbols of a union he strained but never severed. His death was not dramatic, nor marked by grandeur, but in its humility it reflected the contradictions of the man himself, stubborn, proud, and forever contested in memory. By the time Ulysses S. Grant left the White House, he was already weary. Years of war, tobacco, and ceaseless duty had worn down his body. In 1884, the former Union general who had crushed the Confederacy received a diagnosis that would define his final year: cancer of the throat and tongue. At first, he dismissed the soreness as a passing ailment. But soon his voice grew hoarse, swallowing became painful, and every cigar, once his constant companion, turned to poison in his mouth. Doctors confirmed the worst, an incurable carcinoma. There was no treatment but to endure. Grant understood he was dying, yet he refused to waste the time left. Financial misfortune had left his family nearly ruined after a failed investment scheme. Determined not to leave them destitute, he took up his pen. At his bedside, and later on the porches of a quiet cottage at Mount McGregor in the mountains of New York, he began to write his memoirs. The disease advanced relentlessly. Food became impossible to swallow. He lived on soups, milk, and ice chips. His voice weakened to a rasp, forcing him to communicate in whispers or by scribbled notes. The pain was constant, but he pressed on. Every morning, wrapped in blankets, he dictated passages of his campaigns: the blood at Shiloh, the siege of Vicksburg, the surrender at Appomattox. His hand shook, his body wasted, but his mind remained sharp. By the summer of 1885, his body was little more than skin and bone. Visitors described him as pale, frail, and ghost-like, though still dignified. Crowds gathered outside Mount McGregor, hoping for news. Newspapers reported on his struggle daily, framing it as one last campaign by the great general. To the American people, Grant was no longer just the warrior who saved the Union. He had become a symbol of endurance in the face of certain death. On July 19th, he completed the final pages of his memoirs. The effort had nearly killed him, but the manuscript was finished. His friend and publisher, Mark Twain, ensured it would secure financial stability for Julia Grant and their children. At last, Grant allowed himself to rest. The end came only days later. On July 23, 1885, in the cool mountain air, he slipped away in his sleep. He was 63 years old. The memoir he left behind would become one of the greatest works of military history, praised for its clarity, honesty, and quiet dignity. His funeral was among the largest the nation had ever seen. Over 1 million mourners lined the streets of New York as his coffin passed, draped in the stars and stripes. Grant's tomb, rising on the banks of the Hudson River, remains a monument to the man who led the Union to victory and, in his final battle, overcame despair to provide for those he loved. After leaving the White House in 1881, Rutherford B. Hayes settled into a quieter life at Spiegel Grove, his family estate in Fremont, Ohio. Unlike many presidents, he did not chase a return to power or seek great wealth. Instead, he turned his attention to causes that mattered deeply to him: education, veterans' welfare, and civil rights. Hayes served on school boards, supported libraries, and championed opportunities for African Americans, shaping a post-presidential life of service rather than politics. But time was no kinder to him than to any other man. In his later years, Hayes suffered from heart disease, though he rarely spoke of it. He remained active well into his 70s, walking daily around Spiegel Grove's wooded paths and keeping up his correspondence. In early January 1893, Hayes ventured out on a cold Ohio day. The exertion proved too much. He collapsed from a heart attack and was confined to bed. At first, there was hope that physicians believed rest might allow him to recover, but his strength ebbed quickly. Breathing grew shallow, and his pulse weakened. The old soldier, once a general in the Civil War, could feel his body failing. Family gathered at his bedside. His son Webb, himself a veteran, remained close. Hayes spoke of joining his beloved wife, Lucy, who had died 4 years earlier in 1889. Their marriage had been the foundation of his life, and her absence left him with a sorrow that never truly lifted. "I know that I'm going where Lucy is," he whispered in his final hours, words that would be remembered as his last. On the evening of January 17, 1893, Rutherford B. Hayes died quietly at the age of 70. News spread swiftly across the country. Though not remembered as a towering figure of American history, Hayes was respected for his integrity and for his efforts to heal a nation still scarred by the Civil War. His death marked the passing of another link to the generation that had fought to preserve the Union. Funeral services were held at Spiegel Grove, attended by friends, veterans, and neighbors who had long admired his modesty. He was buried beside Lucy in Oakwood Cemetery in Fremont, where the two would rest together. Years later, their remains were moved to a memorial at Spiegel Grove, a lasting tribute to their partnership and devotion. Rutherford B. Hayes's passing was neither dramatic nor violent, but it carried the quiet dignity of a man who lived according to principle. His death, like his life, was steady, disciplined, and unpretentious, the final chapter of a president who never sought glory, yet left behind a legacy of service that endured long after he was gone. James A. Garfield, 1881. James Garfield's presidency had barely begun when tragedy struck. Only 4 months after taking office, he was walking through the Baltimore and Potomac Railway Station in Washington, D.C. on July 2, 1881. As he prepared to board a train for a summer retreat, a disgruntled office seeker named Charles J. Guiteau approached from behind. 2 shots rang out. One grazed Garfield's arm, the other lodged deep in his back, near his spine. At first, the president did not seem fatally wounded. He remained conscious, even speaking to those who rushed to his aid. But medical science in the 1880s was still crude. The bullet was never located, and doctors, ignoring advances in antiseptic techniques, probed the wound repeatedly with unwashed fingers and metal instruments. What might have been a survivable injury soon became a breeding ground for infection. Garfield was carried back to the White House, where a sick room was prepared. For days, he drifted between pain and exhaustion. The oppressive Washington summer turned his chamber into a furnace. The smell of infection hung in the air. His doctors, convinced the bullet must be removed, continued their invasive attempts. Each probe deepened the damage. His body wasted away as abscesses formed and fever rose. Public attention was fixed on his suffering. Newspapers printed daily updates, and crowds gathered outside the White House, hoping for news. Citizens across the nation lit candles and offered prayers. Garfield became not just a president, but a symbol of national anxiety, an entire country holding its breath for his survival. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, even attempted to locate the bullet with a primitive metal detector. The device failed, but not because of an error in principle. His search was thrown off by the metal springs of Garfield's bed. By late summer, Garfield's condition worsened. Unable to keep down food, he wasted away to little more than a skeleton. Pus-filled infections spread through his body, robbing him of strength. Hoping the cooler air of the coast might help, he was moved to a seaside cottage in Elberon, New Jersey, in early September. For a brief moment, he seemed to rally, soothed by the ocean breeze. But the reprieve did not last. On September 19, 1881, after 80 days of agony, James A. Garfield succumbed to sepsis. He was 49 years old, his presidency reduced to weeks of suffering rather than governance. His death shocked the nation not only for its suddenness, but because many believed modern medicine had killed him as much as Guiteau's bullet. Guiteau would later stand trial and be executed, but Garfield's drawn-out death had a more lasting impact. It fueled public demand for medical reform and renewed urgency for civil service reform, as his assassin had claimed delusions of patronage denied. Garfield's end was thus both a personal tragedy and a national turning point, etched into memory as one of the most agonizing presidential deaths in American history. Chester A. Arthur, 1886. When Chester Alan Arthur assumed the presidency in 1881 after the assassination of James Garfield, many doubted him. Known as a product of New York's political machine, he surprised critics by governing with dignity and restraint. But behind the polished appearance of the man they called the gentleman boss was a secret he kept even from close friends. His health was failing. By the early 1880s, Arthur had developed Bright's disease, a chronic and irreversible condition of the kidneys. At first, the symptoms were subtle: fatigue, swelling in the legs, and hand pain. He hid them well, maintaining the fashionable image for which he was known. But as the years passed, the disease tightened its grip. By the time he left office in March 1885, Arthur's body was already in steady decline. He returned to New York City, taking up residence in his elegant Lexington Avenue home. Visitors noted that the once vigorous president now appeared weary, his face puffy, his complexion sallow. He avoided public life, retreating from politics altogether. Though only in his mid-50s, he looked like a man decades older. His physicians tried what little medicine then offered: rest, restricted diet, and attempts to ease symptoms, but nothing could halt the progression. By 1886, Arthur suffered from constant fatigue, swelling, and pain. He could no longer travel, spending most of his time in his townhouse. Friends recalled that he still dressed impeccably, as if determined that dignity should outlast his strength. That autumn, the disease worsened rapidly. His appetite failed, and he grew weaker by the day. In November, bedridden and aware that the end was near, he called his family close. On November 18, 1886, Chester A. Arthur died quietly in his home at the age of 57. The nation mourned in subdued tones. Arthur had not been a transformative president, but his tenure had surprised many. He had championed civil service reform through the Pendleton Act and resisted the corruption that once defined his political career. His death was noted less for tragedy than for the quiet dignity of a man who had risen unexpectedly to the highest office and carried it with steadiness. Arthur was buried beside his wife, Ellen, who had died before his presidency, in the Albany Rural Cemetery in Minnetonka, New York. His grave was marked by a modest granite monument, chosen deliberately to reflect simplicity rather than grandeur. Chester A. Arthur's passing lacked the drama of assassination or the symbolism of dying on Independence Day. It was instead the slow, inevitable decline of a man who once wielded power but could not outpace the failure of his own body. In his death, as in his presidency, Arthur confounded expectations, quiet, restrained, and dignified to the end. Grover Cleveland, 1908. Grover Cleveland's life after the presidency was quieter than his years in office, but not free of struggle. As the only man to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, he carried into retirement a reputation for blunt honesty, stubborn independence, and deep conservatism. By the early 1900s, he had settled with his family in Princeton, New Jersey, where he lectured occasionally at the university and remained an informal elder statesman. Yet, behind the walls of his home, his health was deteriorating. Years of kidney disease and stomach troubles wore him down. He suffered from gout, digestive ailments, and hardening of the arteries. By 1907, his doctors quietly admitted that his condition was irreversible. Though Cleveland never lost his dry wit, his once broad frame wasted away. Visitors noticed the change. The stout, heavy man of the White House years had become frail, almost gaunt, his movements slow and deliberate. In his final months, heart disease compounded his decline. He tired easily and often remained confined to bed, though he still received friends and family when strength allowed. His wife, Frances, and their children stayed constantly by his side, attending to his comfort. Despite the failing of his body, Cleveland's mind remained clear. He spoke candidly about his life, the burdens of the presidency, and his enduring hope that he had done right by the nation. By June 1908, he was too weak to rise from his bed. His heart faltered, his breath came shallow, and every exertion left him near collapse. On the morning of June 24th, a sudden attack of pain struck. He clutched at his chest and whispered his final words, "I have tried so hard to do right." Minutes later, Grover Cleveland was gone, felled by a massive heart attack at the age of 71. News of his death spread quickly. For many, Cleveland represented a vanishing era of politics, a man who had resisted party bosses and confronted corruption with stubborn resolve. His funeral was simple, reflecting his own wishes. He was buried in Princeton Cemetery, beneath a modest headstone, far from the grandeur that might have accompanied a 2-term president. Cleveland's passing was remembered less for spectacle than for character. He had lived without ostentation and died without fanfare, leaving behind a legacy of probity and public service. His final words became an epitaph repeated often in the days that followed, an expression of duty and conscience rather than ambition. For a man once accused of being too ordinary, too unpolished, Cleveland's death revealed the quiet power of integrity. He left office a controversial figure, but in death, he became a symbol of steadfastness. His passing in 1908 closed the life of one of America's most singular presidents, the only one to leave the White House, return, and leave again, carrying with him the burdens of two non-consecutive chapters in American history. Benjamin Harrison, 1901. Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States, left office in 1893 a quiet man, respected though overshadowed by the larger personalities of his age. After his presidency, he resumed a dignified life as a lawyer and lecturer in Indianapolis, and for a time, his health seemed steady. But by the dawn of the new century, age and illness began to weigh on him. Harrison lived in a stately brick house on Delaware Street, where he shared his later years with his second wife, Mary Scott Lord Dimmock, and their young daughter. To friends and neighbors, he appeared reserved yet approachable, often seen strolling the streets or attending church services. But by early 1901, his strength had begun to fade. A persistent cough troubled him, accompanied by weakness and fatigue. Physicians soon recognized the signs of pneumonia, a disease that, in that era, carried a grave prognosis. The illness advanced quickly. Within days, his lungs filled with fluid, making every breath a battle. Harrison, aware of his condition, bore it with stoicism. Family gathered at his bedside, where the former president remained calm, his voice often reduced to a whisper. His wife and daughter sat close, tending to him in the hushed rooms of the Indianapolis home. Doctors tried what remedies they could: poultices, rest, and carefully administered stimulants to keep his failing heart steady. But Harrison was 78, and his body could not rally against the infection. The pneumonia tightened its grip, leaving him bedridden and gasping for air. On March 13, 1901, the struggle ended. Surrounded by family, Harrison slipped away quietly. His final hours were marked not by dramatic declarations, but by the soft, labored breaths of a man fighting until the last. His passing drew national attention. Though no longer a central political figure, he was remembered as a man of firm principles, a Civil War veteran who had carried the presidency with dignity. Funeral services were held in Indianapolis, where crowds lined the streets to pay respects. The body of the former president was carried to Crown Hill Cemetery, a sprawling resting place where many of Indiana's great figures lie. He was interred beside his first wife, Caroline, who had died a decade earlier in the White House. In death, as in life, Harrison was remembered without grandeur. He had presided over a period of economic transformation, admitted new states to the Union, and strengthened America's Navy, yet he never carried the aura of a towering statesman. Instead, he was recalled as a thoughtful, precise, and earnest man who served faithfully and bore his burdens without display. Benjamin Harrison's death from pneumonia in 1901 was a reminder of the frailty even presidents cannot escape. He had lived with modest dignity and departed in the same manner, leaving behind a legacy rooted in steadiness rather than spectacle. William McKinley, 1901. The presidency of William McKinley ended not in old age or quiet decline, but in a sudden act of violence that stunned the nation. In September 1901, at the height of his popularity, McKinley traveled to Buffalo, New York, to attend the Pan American Exposition, a world's fair celebrating progress in industry. The crowds adored him, eager for a glimpse of the genial president whose steady leadership had guided the country through war with Spain and into a new century. On September 6th, McKinley stood in the Temple of Music, a grand domed hall filled with thousands waiting to greet him. He moved slowly along the reception line, shaking hands, smiling, speaking brief words of courtesy. Among the visitors stood Leon Zalgas, a young anarchist who had hidden a revolver beneath a handkerchief wrapped around his hand. When he approached the president, McKinley extended his arm in greeting. Two shots rang out. The first bullet grazed him, The second struck deep into his abdomen. McKinley staggered, then straightened, insisting to the crowd, "Be easy. It's all right." He was carried to a nearby house, where doctors worked frantically to locate and remove the bullet. They managed to close the wound, but surgical techniques of the time were limited. Unknown to them, the slug remained lodged inside, and infection soon set in. At first, McKinley seemed to recover. For several days, his condition stabilized and hope grew. He spoke gently to his wife, Ida, reassuring her even as he endured waves of pain. Visitors described him as calm, almost serene, his thoughts fixed more on her well-being than his own suffering. But by September 12th, his health began to collapse. Gangrene had spread through his abdomen, poisoning his blood. His skin grew pale, his pulse faltered, and doctors admitted that nothing more could be done. McKinley's final hours were marked by composure. On the evening of September 13th, he whispered to Ida, "It is God's way. His will be done, not ours." Early the next morning, on September 14th, 1901, William McKinley died quietly. The 25th president brought down not by age or illness, but by an assassin's bullet. The nation plunged into mourning. His body lay in state at the Capitol, where tens of thousands filed past the coffin draped in black crepe. Bells tolled across cities, flags hung at half-mast, and church services filled with weeping congregants. In Canton, Ohio, where he was laid to rest, vast crowds gathered to honor the hometown leader who had risen to the highest office. His assassination was more than a personal tragedy. It altered the course of American history. With McKinley gone, the presidency passed to his young vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, whose energetic leadership would redefine the role. McKinley's death marked both the end of one era and the violent beginning of another, a reminder that even in an age of modern progress, a single act of hatred could change a nation overnight. Theodore Roosevelt, 1919. Few presidents lived with the restless energy of Theodore Roosevelt, and few burned out so completely. By the end of his life, the man once described as a steam engine in trousers had been worn down by years of ceaseless activity, injury, and illness. His youth had been defined by frailty, chronic asthma, and weak lungs, but through sheer willpower, he had built a body and reputation of iron. By 1919, however, the years of relentless exertion and the lingering effects of malaria and infections caught during his 1913 Amazon expedition had left him weakened. After leaving the White House, Roosevelt never slowed. He campaigned vigorously, wrote prolifically, and threw himself into politics with the Progressive Bull Moose Party. Yet defeats, including his failure to reclaim the presidency in 1912, weighed heavily on him. The Amazon journey nearly killed him. A festering leg wound turned septic, fevers racked his body, and his health never truly recovered. Doctors privately warned that he had shaved years off his life. By late 1918, Roosevelt was in visible decline. His legs ached constantly from inflammatory arthritis and recurring infections. He relied on crutches to move about Sagamore Hill, his Long Island estate, though he remained mentally vigorous and continued to write essays, letters, and commentary on world affairs. Visitors noted the contrast, the booming voice still alive, the sharp eyes undimmed, but the once bounding physical energy gone. In early January 1919, an infection in his lungs worsened into inflammatory rheumatism and pulmonary complications. He was confined to bed, his family close at hand. Roosevelt himself seemed resigned, even calm. "I have had a wonderful life," he told one visitor, "and I am thankful for it." On the night of January 5th, he retired after a quiet evening with his wife, Edith. In the early hours of January 6th, as the snow fell silently outside, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep of a coronary embolism. He was 60 years old. His son Archie telegraphed his siblings with a simple, poignant message: "The old lion is dead." News of his passing spread across the world. Roosevelt had been larger than life as a president, soldier, explorer, and writer whose sheer vitality embodied the American spirit. His funeral was held at Christ Church in Oyster Bay, attended by family, friends, and dignitaries, yet marked by simplicity at his own request. He was buried at Young's Memorial Cemetery, overlooking the waters he had loved since childhood. Roosevelt's death was mourned as the closing of an age. For many Americans, it felt as though the nation had lost not just a leader, but an elemental force. He had lived furiously, embraced every challenge, and in the end, slipped quietly away, leaving behind the legend of a man who seemed never meant to rest. William Howard Taft, 1930. William Howard Taft, the only man to serve both as President and Chief Justice of the United States, carried a public life unmatched in distinction. Yet in his final years, he was diminished by illness and frailty. Once a figure of immense physical presence, his great bulk was the subject of jokes and caricatures. Taft's later decline was steady and visible, a reminder that even the strongest public careers end in the quiet surrender of the body. After leaving the White House in 1913, Taft found his truest calling not in politics, but on the bench. Appointed Chief Justice in 1921, he presided over the Supreme Court with diligence and satisfaction, believing the role far better suited to his temperament than the presidency. But by the late 1920s, his health had faltered. He suffered from high blood pressure, heart disease, and a growing sense of fatigue that forced him to withdraw from public life. By 1929, the decline was unmistakable. He lost weight rapidly, nearly 100 pounds in just a few years, his once robust frame wasting away. He complained of sleepless nights, persistent pain, and weakness in his limbs. Physicians diagnosed severe heart disease, with hardening arteries and kidney complications. His mind, once sharp and judicial, began to falter under the strain of constant illness. In February 1930, Taft resigned from the Supreme Court, knowing he could no longer perform his duties. His decision was reluctant but unavoidable, the final act of a man who had devoted his life to service. He returned to his Washington home, where he was confined to bed, attended by his wife Helen and close family members. As winter deepened, Taft's strength ebbed further. His heart grew weaker by the day, and his doctors knew the end was near. On the evening of March 7th, he drifted into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and irregular. By the next morning, March 8th, 1930, William Howard Taft was dead at the age of 72. The nation mourned the passing of its 27th president and 10th Chief Justice. His funeral was held at All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C., where President Herbert Hoover and members of the Supreme Court attended. In a final mark of honor, Taft was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, the first president to rest there. His grave, shaded by trees, remains a quiet reminder of a man whose service spanned both the executive and judicial pinnacles of American government. Taft's death closed the chapter of a statesman who had never sought greatness in politics but had found it in law. His last years, though marked by pain, underscored his lifelong devotion to duty. He left behind the rare legacy of a man who held the highest offices in two branches of government, remembered less for flamboyance than for steady, unyielding service. Woodrow Wilson, 1924. Woodrow Wilson, the austere professor-president who led America through the First World War, did not leave office in triumph but in ruin. The strain of war, the fight for the League of Nations, and unrelenting political battles broke his health long before they broke his spirit. His body failed in the White House itself, where a massive stroke in October 1919 left him half paralyzed, nearly blind in one eye, and dependent on others for the simplest tasks. The man who had once stood before Congress with lofty visions of a new world order was reduced to silence, shuffling steps, and the private frustrations of a captive life. For the remainder of his presidency, Wilson became an invalid, shielded from the public gaze. His wife, Edith controlled access to him, deciding which matters of state he could confront and which would pass unacknowledged. Rumors swirled of a secret regency, of a government run not by the elected president, but by his wife and a handful of aides. Wilson himself, confined to the second floor of the White House, spent long hours staring into space, his thoughts distant, his body unwilling. When his term ended in 1921, Wilson retired to a brick townhouse on S Street in Washington, D.C. There, he lived in seclusion. His days were marked by routine, brief carriage rides through the city, slow walks with a cane, and evenings sitting in silence while Edith read to him. Visitors found him frail, his voice weak, his once commanding presence shriveled into fragility. Yet his mind remained fixed on the causes he had championed, especially the League of Nations, which he believed would vindicate his life's work, even as the United States refused to join it. By 1923, Wilson's health had declined further. He suffered from high blood pressure, urinary problems, and recurring headaches. The strength that had carried him through years of political warfare was gone. He grew thinner, his face pale, his hands trembling as he struggled even to sign his name. Still, he clung to dignity, appearing occasionally on his front steps to wave to small crowds of admirers who gathered outside. On February 2, 1924, Wilson's condition worsened. He complained of exhaustion, his breathing labored, his body too weak to rise from bed. The next day, February 3rd, at around 11:15 a.m., Woodrow Wilson died quietly in his home. He was 67. Edith sat beside him, his constant guardian to the end, closing the chapter of a man who had once carried the hopes of nations. The funeral was modest, reflecting his own wishes. He was buried at Washington National Cathedral, the only president interred within the capital city. His passing marked not only the end of a life, but the end of an era, the last president of the progressive age, undone by the very burdens of the office he had sought with such fervor. Wilson's death left behind a legacy both visionary and divisive. To some, he was a prophet of peace betrayed by politics. To others, an inflexible leader blinded by pride. But in the quiet room where his life ended, there was no grandeur, only silence, and the stillness of a body that had given all it could. Warren G. Harding, 1923. Warren Gamaliel Harding, the 29th President of the United States, entered the White House with promises of normalcy after the upheaval of World War I. His genial manner and broad smile gave him an air of reassurance. Yet beneath the surface, his administration would be marred by scandal and whispers of corruption. Harding himself was not a man of a strong constitution. He suffered from hypertension, cardiac weakness, and digestive troubles, ailments hidden from a public that knew him as a tall, charismatic figure. In the summer of 1923, Harding embarked on what became known as the Voyage of Understanding, a grueling cross-country tour meant to reconnect him with the people and restore trust in his presidency. From Ohio to Alaska and down the Pacific coast, the trip stretched his strength to the limit. Crowds cheered him in city after city, yet those close to him saw the toll. He complained of chest pains, stomach cramps, and overwhelming fatigue. By late July, Harding's condition worsened dramatically. In Vancouver, he collapsed briefly in his hotel, and his doctors suspected food poisoning. When he reached San Francisco, he was admitted to the Palace Hotel, confined to his suite under close observation. The physicians debated his illness. Some blamed indigestion, others pneumonia. Modern medical analysis suggests that congestive heart failure is a disease little understood at the time. On the evening of August 2, 1923, Harding seemed to rally. He read the newspapers with Edith, his devoted wife, and remarked with relief that his reputation appeared to be improving. But later that night, as she read aloud to him, his body suddenly stiffened. Without warning, his pulse ceased. At 7:35 p.m., Warren Harding died at just 57 years old. The shock was immediate. Newspapers across the nation proclaimed the loss of a beloved leader. Millions mourned, their grief genuine. Yet whispers quickly followed. Harding's sudden collapse fueled speculation. Some believed he had been poisoned to spare him the disgrace of the scandals soon to erupt around his administration. Others accused Edith herself, claiming she had silenced him to protect his name. Though these stories spread widely, no evidence ever supported them. Harding's body was carried back to Washington, D.C., where he lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Tens of thousands filed past in silence. His funeral in Marion, Ohio, drew crowds that lined the streets for miles, a final tribute to the man who had promised healing to a weary nation. But history would not be kind. Within months, the Teapot Dome scandal and other revelations cast his presidency into shadow, transforming his legacy into one of corruption and incompetence. His sudden death, once mourned, came to symbolize an unfinished and deeply flawed leadership. In the quiet of that San Francisco hotel room, however, none of this mattered. Harding died as he had lived, seeking approval, resting in the presence of his wife, unaware of the storm his passing would unleash. His journey ended not in triumph, but in controversy and unanswered questions. Calvin Coolidge, 1933. Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, was a man of few words. Nicknamed Silent Cal, he became known for his restraint, his dry wit, and his ability to project calm during the turbulent 1920s. He left office in 1929 at the height of prosperity, but within months, the Great Depression engulfed the nation. Coolidge, by then retired to his home in Northampton, Massachusetts, lived to watch the unraveling of the economic system he had once presided over, though he rarely spoke publicly about it. By temperament, Coolidge was private, austere, and deeply reserved. In retirement, he lived a quiet routine in a modest clapboard house on Massasoit Street. He wrote articles for magazines, fished in the Vermont countryside, and maintained a small circle of friends. But beneath the outward calm, he struggled with declining health. Coolidge suffered from coronary disease, hypertension, and arteriosclerosis. His once lean frame grew gaunt, his energy diminished, and by the early 1930s, he was noticeably weakened. January 5, 1933, began like any other winter morning. Snow blanketed the hills of New England, and the former president prepared for a simple day. At his home, he planned to meet with a local barber for a haircut. Edith, his wife, left briefly to run errands, expecting nothing unusual. Coolidge climbed the stairs to his bedroom to change clothes. But there, in the solitude of his private chambers, his body betrayed him. At some point between late morning and noon, Coolidge suffered a sudden coronary thrombosis, a massive heart attack. He collapsed instantly, likely without warning or time for words. When Edith returned home a short time later, she found him lying motionless on the floor. He was 60 years old. The news of his death stunned the country. Although he had been out of office for 4 years, Coolidge remained a respected elder statesman. His sudden passing, so quiet and unceremonious, seemed to mirror the character of the man himself. There had been no long illness, no drawn-out decline, only the abrupt silence of a heart that had beaten steadily through the roaring decade he had governed. Funeral services reflected his simplicity. At Edwards Congregational Church in Northampton, there were no grand displays of power or pomp. The coffin was unadorned, the service restrained, the tributes muted. He was buried in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, his birthplace, in the small cemetery where his family rested. There, under a plain granite marker, Silent Cal joined the New England soil that had shaped him. For many, Coolidge's death carried symbolic weight. He had presided over the optimism of the 1920s, a decade of growth and speculation, and died just as the nation sank deeper into despair during the Great Depression. His life seemed to embody the fleeting prosperity of that era, reserved, understated, yet decisive in its brevity. In the end, Calvin Coolidge left this world as he had lived in it, quietly, without fanfare, a man whose silence spoke louder than words. His epitaph was as concise as his speeches, Silent Cal. Herbert Hoover, 1964. Herbert Hoover, the 31st President of the United States, entered the White House in 1929 with a sterling reputation as a humanitarian and engineer. He had fed millions in war-torn Europe during the First World War and was celebrated as a man of practical solutions. But the crash of the stock market came only months after his inauguration, and the Great Depression defined his presidency. For decades afterward, his name was tied to breadlines, unemployment, and national despair. Yet Hoover lived long enough to see his reputation partly restored. After leaving office, he withdrew from politics, but during the Second World War, Franklin Roosevelt quietly sought his expertise for relief efforts. Later, under Harry Truman, Hoover headed commissions to reorganize the federal government. His knowledge of administration and his dedication to public service returned him to a position of respect, even if the scars of 1930s politics never fully faded. By the 1950s, Hoover was one of the oldest surviving statesmen of his generation. He lived in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, surrounded by books, papers, and visitors who still sought his advice. He published memoirs, gave speeches, and maintained correspondence with presidents from Truman to Johnson. Age, however, crept in steadily. He developed kidney disease, high blood pressure, and problems with his gastrointestinal system. In October 1964, Hoover suffered a massive gastrointestinal hemorrhage. He was rushed to Doctors Hospital in Manhattan, where physicians worked to stabilize him. The bleeding was severe, and complications set in. For a man who had once commanded vast relief efforts and overseen global food supplies, the struggle now came down to keeping his own frail body alive. Confined to bed, Hoover remained lucid, speaking with visitors and reflecting on his long life. He remarked to close friends that he felt ready for the end, noting that few men had been granted so many years. Nurses recalled his stoicism, the calm dignity of a man who had endured public disgrace and slow rehabilitation but never surrendered to bitterness. On October 20th, 1964, at the age of 90, Herbert Hoover died in his New York suite. He had lived longer than any president before him, his life stretching from the era of horse-drawn carriages into the nuclear age. The boy born in an Iowa two-room cabin, orphaned at 9, and later exalted to the highest office of the land, had outlasted most of his critics. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where thousands filed past in tribute. He was then returned to West Branch, Iowa, and buried beside his wife, Lou Henry, on the grounds of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. Hoover's long twilight softened his memory. Though forever linked with the Great Depression, his final decades reminded the nation of his lifelong dedication to service, his engineering mind, and his humanitarian spirit. His death was not dramatic, but like his life, marked by persistence, endurance, and an unyielding sense of duty. Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1945. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, held office longer than any other man in American history. Elected 4 times, he carried the nation through the Great Depression and most of the Second World War. By the spring of 1945, however, Roosevelt was a man visibly worn by the burdens of leadership. He had been diagnosed with polio in 1921 and never regained the use of his legs, though he hid this fact from the public with great effort. As president, he projected vigor and optimism, but the strain of 12 years in power left its mark. Photographs from the Yalta Conference in February 1945 show a gaunt, pale figure. His doctors knew the truth. Roosevelt suffered from severe hypertension, an enlarged heart, and hardening of the arteries. His blood pressure was dangerously high, and his health had become precarious. Seeking rest, Roosevelt retreated to Warm Springs, Georgia, the therapeutic spa he had long used as a personal sanctuary. There, in the company of aides, doctors, and a few close companions, he continued to oversee the final offensives of the war. On April 12, 1945, the president sat for a portrait in the Little White House. He complained of a terrible headache, slumped forward, and lost consciousness. Physicians rushed to his side, but nothing could be done. Roosevelt had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He was dead within minutes. The news struck the nation like a thunderclap. Roosevelt had been president for over a decade. Many Americans could scarcely remember another leader. Radios carried the announcement across the country, and ordinary citizens wept openly in the streets. Though the war in Europe was nearing victory, the president who had guided them through its darkest hours was gone. His body was carried by train from Georgia to Washington. Along the route, crowds gathered silently by the tracks, hats removed, heads bowed as the funeral train passed. In the Capitol, his casket was placed in the East Room of the White House, echoing the funeral of Abraham Lincoln 80 years earlier. From there, he was taken to Hyde Park, New York, where he was buried in the garden of his family estate, beside his beloved dog Fala. The timing of his death carried immense consequences. Within hours, Vice President Harry Truman was sworn in, a man who had been kept largely in the dark about the Manhattan Project and the coming atomic age. Roosevelt's sudden passing left the outcome of the war and the shape of the post-war world in the hands of new leadership. Franklin Roosevelt's death marked the end of an era. For 12 years, his voice had been the steady assurance of fireside chats, his leadership a constant through depression and war. His decline had been hidden, but his end was swift. Americans mourned not only a president, but the collapse of a towering presence who had seemed to embody the endurance of the Republic itself. Harry S. Truman, 1972. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, was a man of plain speech and decisive action. Ascending to the presidency upon Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death in 1945, Truman made history by ordering the use of atomic weapons against Japan and guiding the nation through the early Cold War. Yet for all the weight of global decisions he bore, Truman lived long after his presidency, his final decades marked by quiet reflection and steadily declining health. After leaving the White House in 1953, Truman returned to Independence, Missouri, where he settled into the modest life he had always preferred. He avoided Washington's political theater, though he remained a symbol of integrity and resolve. He wrote memoirs, entertained occasional visitors, and attended to local affairs, all while maintaining the simple habits that had shaped him, reading newspapers each morning, walking his property, and enjoying the companionship of his wife, Bess. By the late 1960s, Truman's body began to betray the years of relentless labor and stress. He suffered from heart disease, high blood pressure, and the cumulative toll of aging. Pneumonia struck intermittently, and organ systems began to fail one by one. Still, his mind remained alert. Visitors remembered him joking with reporters, offering sharp commentary on contemporary politics, and reflecting on history with the keen judgment that had guided him in office. In December 1972, Truman's health deteriorated rapidly. Pneumonia set in, compounded by multiple organ failure. Physicians monitored him closely at Kansas City's research hospital, providing oxygen, intravenous fluids, and medications to ease his pain. Yet his body, resilient for decades, finally reached its limit. On December 26, 1972, at the age of 88, Harry Truman passed away quietly in the early hours of the morning. Unlike many world leaders, his death was unaccompanied by scandal or sudden violence. It was the natural conclusion of a long, storied life. His wife and family were present, witnessing the final breaths of a man who had carried the weight of nations with a combination of plain-spoken pragmatism and steely resolve. Truman's funeral reflected both his personal simplicity and the magnitude of his legacy. The nation honored him with ceremonies in Washington, D.C., and his final interment was in his beloved Independence. Flags were lowered, and citizens lined the streets to pay tribute. His passing closed the chapter on a president whose life spanned the Great Depression, World War II, and the onset of the Cold War, a witness to the 20th century's most defining moments. The death of Harry Truman was a reminder of the quiet dignity that can accompany the end of leadership. He left no great ostentation in his passing, only the legacy of a life committed to duty and moral clarity. His presidency had been marked by difficult choices and decisive actions. His death was marked by the same dignity and fortitude that defined his years in office. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1969. Dwight David Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States, had lived a life defined by strategy, leadership, and relentless commitment. From the battlefields of Europe to the Oval Office, he had commanded the respect of soldiers and statesmen alike. Yet in his final years, the man who orchestrated D-Day and led the nation through the early Cold War found himself facing the ultimate campaign: the slow, inexorable decline of the body. Eisenhower's health had been precarious since the presidency. Years of hypertension, heart attacks, and gallbladder complications foreshadowed the struggles that would eventually claim him. Even while in office, he was a frequent patient, undergoing surgeries and suffering episodes that required close monitoring. Upon leaving the White House in 1961, he retreated to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, seeking rest and the solace of routine. Yet, even in retirement, the general-turned-president remained active in public life, attending ceremonies, advising leaders, and meeting with friends, despite the increasing frailty of his body. By the mid-1960s, Eisenhower's health had steadily deteriorated. He suffered from repeated cardiac episodes, strokes, and bouts of pneumonia. His energy waned, walking became laborious, and he relied more heavily on assistance for daily tasks. Friends observed a man who had once led armies with decisive clarity now constrained by weakness, his commanding presence diminished by age and illness. In early 1969, Eisenhower's condition worsened markedly. He was admitted to Walter Reed Army Medical Center for heart failure, complicated by arteriosclerosis and respiratory distress. Monitors tracked his declining cardiac output, and physicians worked tirelessly to manage his symptoms, but the damage was irreversible. The general's once indomitable will could not halt the physiological decline of his body. Surrounded by family and a small circle of trusted aides, Eisenhower endured the final days with remarkable composure. Though he was conscious at intervals, he required oxygen and medication to sustain him. On March 28, 1969, at the age of 78, Dwight D. Eisenhower's heart finally gave out. He passed quietly, leaving behind the tangible presence of history itself, the commander who had led a generation to victory, and the president who had steered the nation through tense global uncertainty. His funeral reflected both his military distinction and presidential dignity. State honors were rendered, including a 21-gun salute, military processions, and ceremonies at the Capitol. Yet amid the grandeur, there remained the human shadow of the man who had spent a lifetime in service, whose death marked the end of a chapter that had shaped the course of the 20th century. Eisenhower's passing was a reminder that even the strongest, most disciplined individuals are subject to time and mortality. His body, once capable of commanding armies and nations, had finally surrendered, leaving behind a legacy of leadership, courage, and a nation indebted to his steady hand. John F. Kennedy, 1963. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, embodied the youthful promise and charisma of a new era. He was a leader whose energy, eloquence, and vision captivated a nation recovering from war and preparing for the uncertainties of the Cold War. Yet his life and presidency, radiant and vigorous, were cut abruptly short in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, a day that would reverberate across the world. Kennedy's health had long been fragile. Secretly, he battled Addison's disease, chronic back pain from a World War II injury, and other ailments that would have challenged even the strongest constitution. Yet he projected vitality, appearing vigorous during public appearances, debates, and international travel. Few outside his inner circle were aware of the daily pain he endured or the medications that kept him functioning. That morning in Dallas, Kennedy rode through the streets in an open-top motorcade, waving to cheering crowds. The November sun glinted off the city, the atmosphere festive, the promise of political reconciliation in Texas palpable. Riding alongside him were Jacqueline Kennedy, Governor John Connally, and other dignitaries. At precisely 12:30 p.m., the serenity was shattered. Shots rang out from the Texas School Book Depository. One bullet struck Kennedy in the neck and shoulder, and a second struck his head, catastrophic in its immediacy. Chaos erupted. Governor Connally was hit but survived, while Kennedy's body slumped forward, his hands instinctively reaching for his throat. Secret Service agents scrambled, and the presidential limousine accelerated to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Inside Parkland, physicians worked frantically, but it was immediately evident that Kennedy's injuries were unsurvivable. His brain had been fatally damaged. For 30 minutes, surgeons attempted emergency procedures, though the outcome was tragically predetermined. At 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 36 years old. The nation froze. News broadcasts interrupted normal programming. Americans from coast to coast were stunned into silence. Crowds gathered outside hospitals, and faces turned to televisions in disbelief. The sudden loss of a young, dynamic leader so full of promise, so aware of the burdens he carried, felt like the shattering of the American dream itself. Kennedy's body was transported back to Washington, D.C., and the funeral was meticulously planned to reflect the gravity of the loss. Flags were lowered to half-mast, military honors rendered, and a nation collectively mourned. His coffin, draped with the stars and stripes, was borne through the streets of the capital, accompanied by an unprecedented outpouring of grief. Jacqueline Kennedy's composure and grace, even in devastation, became an indelible image of mourning and resilience. The assassination left behind shockwaves that extended beyond grief. Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency, burdened with the sudden responsibility of leading a grieving and unsettled nation. Kennedy's death symbolized not only the vulnerability of political power, but the abrupt fragility of life itself. In the quiet aftermath, historians would debate motives, implications, and conspiracies. Yet in the streets of Dallas that day, the reality was immediate and raw. A young man, brilliant and ambitious, had been struck down, leaving behind a nation forever changed, a legacy frozen in the fleeting brilliance of life cut tragically short. Lyndon B. Johnson, 1973. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, had once ruled the nation from the White House with a combination of forceful ambition and relentless drive. From passing landmark civil rights legislation to escalating American involvement in Vietnam, Johnson's presidency was marked by achievement and controversy alike. Yet by the time he retired to his Texas ranch in Stonewall, he had become a man weighed down by the consequences of his own decisions, both political and personal. Johnson's health had long been precarious. Years of smoking, excessive work, and a relentless stress load had left his cardiovascular system weakened. He suffered from hypertension and arteriosclerosis, and his heart bore the strain of decades of exertion. Friends and family noted his diminishing energy, the pale pallor of a once robust man, and the slow, heavy toll of age. On January 22, 1973, at his ranch, Johnson's heart betrayed him. Alone in his home, he suffered a massive myocardial infarction. a heart attack so sudden that there was no time for intervention. By the time his aides or paramedics could arrive, it was already too late. Johnson collapsed, his life extinguished quietly, away from the glare of public scrutiny and the burdens of a presidency that had reshaped the nation. Though he had once occupied the world stage, Johnson's final moments were solitary. The ranch, sprawling across the Texas Hill Country, offered only the company of history and memory. In those quiet last moments, there was no fanfare, no cameras, no political spectacle, just the slow, inevitable silence of a man whose life had been intertwined with the course of a nation's most turbulent decade. News of his death spread quickly, prompting reflections on the duality of his legacy. Johnson had been a master legislator, forging transformative social programs that reduced poverty, expanded civil rights, and reshaped the nation's moral compass. Yet the Vietnam War had left an indelible mark of controversy and division. As the nation mourned, debates surfaced over the successes and failures of his presidency, a reminder that historical judgment is often as complex as life itself. Johnson was buried in the Johnson family cemetery at his ranch, alongside his wife, Lady Bird, in accordance with his wishes. The funeral was modest, reflective of his own sense of Texan simplicity, and attended by dignitaries and former colleagues who had witnessed his immense political skill firsthand. The ceremonies, though somber, carried the quiet dignity of a man who had wielded enormous power, yet met death in the unassuming stillness of home. In death as in life, Johnson's story was one of contrasts. A tireless achiever who bore both praise and blame. A president who shaped society but could not escape its scrutiny, and a man whose final moments were marked not by public spectacle, but by the unyielding reality of mortality. His passing underscored a truth shared by all presidents, from Washington onward. The office may wield power, but it cannot forestall the inevitability of human frailty. Richard Nixon, 1994. Richard Milhous Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, was a man of contrasts, brilliant in strategy, formidable in foreign policy, yet irrevocably marked by scandal. He had ascended to the pinnacle of power in 1969, guiding the nation through Vietnam, opening relations with China, and overseeing détente with the Soviet Union. Yet the Watergate scandal, his subsequent resignation, and the shadow of public distrust would define his legacy long after he left office. Nixon's later years were quieter, yet the weight of history and age bore down on him. Living in New Jersey, he continued to write, lecture, and reflect upon his life and politics, attempting to rehabilitate a reputation once shattered by the scandal of his resignation. Yet decades of stress, political battles, and chronic health issues had eroded his vitality. By the early 1990s, Nixon suffered from vascular disease, hypertension, and the lingering effects of heart attacks, all compounded by advancing age. In April 1994, at his home in New Jersey, Nixon experienced a severe cerebrovascular event, a massive stroke that struck without warning. He became incapacitated almost instantly, losing the ability to speak or respond. Family members and aides rushed him to a nearby hospital, but the damage was irreparable. For 4 days, he lingered in intensive care, his body weakened, his consciousness dimmed. Medical interventions could not reverse the catastrophic effects of the stroke. On April 22, 1994, Richard Nixon died at the age of 81. His passing was both quiet and somber, far removed from the tumult of the Oval Office or the courtroom drama of Watergate. The former president's final hours reflected a retreat from public scrutiny, a private reckoning after a life of extraordinary ambition, extraordinary achievement, and extraordinary controversy. His death prompted widespread reflection on a presidency defined by extremes. Historians noted his remarkable accomplishments in foreign policy, the opening of China, strategic arms limitations, and the winding down of the Vietnam War, while also confronting the moral and legal crises that forced him from office. The duality of his legacy mirrored the duality of his final years, a private struggle against the frailty of his body, a public life forever etched in history. Nixon's funeral and memorial services were measured, befitting the restrained dignity he cultivated after the presidency. World leaders and former aides paid tribute, emphasizing both his political genius and the cautionary lessons of ambition unchecked. Yet, even in death, his life inspired debate, a reminder that leadership, power, and human imperfection are often inseparable. Richard Nixon's passing illustrated the inevitability shared by all who hold the highest office. For all his strategic mind, all his accomplishments, and all his controversies, he, like every president before him, could not escape the finality of mortality. His life ended quietly, leaving behind a complex legacy, unresolved questions, and a nation compelled to reckon with both the triumphs and failures of one of its most enigmatic leaders. Gerald Ford, 2006. Gerald Rudolph Ford, the 38th President of the United States, lived a life marked by service, humility, and steadiness. Ascending to the presidency in the wake of Richard Nixon's resignation, Ford faced the monumental task of healing a nation torn by scandal, distrust, and political upheaval. Though he never faced election to the office he assumed, his calm demeanor and pragmatic leadership restored a sense of order and credibility to the White House. After leaving office in 1977, Ford remained an elder statesman, widely respected for his integrity, sense of duty, and dedication to public service. He spent decades engaged in philanthropic work, attending political events, and maintaining an active lifestyle, including skiing, golfing, and swimming well into his later years. Despite the physical demands of age, Ford's constitution remained resilient, his mind sharp, and his public engagement ongoing. By the early 2000s, however, the inexorable toll of age became evident. Heart issues and mobility limitations began to affect him, though he retained the vitality and humor that had characterized his life. Family, friends, and aides noted his enduring clarity of thought, his gentleness in conversation, and the dignity with which he accepted the gradual decline of physical strength. In late December 2006, Gerald Ford's health deteriorated rapidly. At the age of 93, he experienced heart failure that proved irreversible. Surrounded by family in Rancho Mirage, California, Ford faced his final hours with the quiet courage and composure that had defined both his presidency and his life. In the stillness of his home, away from political theaters and public scrutiny, he passed peacefully, leaving behind a life of remarkable longevity, service, and example. Ford's death marked the end of an era. He became, at the time, the longest-lived U.S. president in history, a living connection to the turbulent decades of mid-20th century America. The nation remembered him for his steady hand during one of its most vulnerable moments, the grace with which he pardoned his predecessor, and the humility with which he carried the weight of office and the consequences of history. Funeral services reflected both his personal modesty and public stature. Tributes flowed from former presidents, political leaders, and citizens alike, emphasizing the consistency, integrity, and decency of a life dedicated to the Republic. Flags flew at half-mast. Memorials celebrated a president who, in an age of crisis and suspicion, had offered reassurance and calm. Gerald Ford's passing was not marked by drama or tragedy, but by the simple inevitability of mortality. He had lived through war, the Cold War, and the social transformations of modern America, witnessing more than 9 decades of history unfold. His death closed the final chapter of a man who, though never elected to the presidency, had exercised it with a quiet strength, leaving a legacy of stability, dignity, and enduring public service. Ronald Reagan, 2004. Ronald Wilson Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, had traversed the American century as actor, governor, and president, embodying optimism, resilience, and the force of personal narrative. By the end of his presidency in 1989, he had overseen the final years of the Cold War, bolstered the national economy, and reshaped the American political landscape. Yet in his later years, the vitality that had defined his public persona began to wane, heralding a long, slow battle against the inexorable decline of age and illness. Reagan had always been mindful of his health, maintaining exercise routines and a disciplined lifestyle. However, in 1994, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a condition that would slowly erode memory, speech, and autonomy. For a man whose career relied on charisma, clarity of expression, and mental agility, the diagnosis was particularly cruel. Over the ensuing decade, his family and close aides witnessed the gradual retreat of the man who had once filled auditoriums with his voice, leaving behind a shadow of the president who had commanded the world's attention. By 2004, Reagan's condition had deteriorated significantly. He struggled with cognitive and physical decline, though he remained aware enough at times to appreciate family visits and the presence of friends. His once resonant voice grew weaker, speech slower, yet his dignity and warmth persisted in fleeting moments. Complications arose when pneumonia set in a final, insidious assault on an aging body already compromised by years of degenerative disease. Surrounded by family at his home in Los Angeles, Reagan endured his final days with the quiet resilience that had defined his approach to life. Though he no longer engaged with public affairs or political discourse, the presence of loved ones provided solace and continuity. The family ensured he was comfortable, attending to his medical needs, speaking to him softly, and honoring the decades-long life of public service he had led. On June 5, 2004, Ronald Reagan passed away at the age of 93. His death marked the culmination of a long twilight, one in which the public figure had faded into private life, leaving behind the enduring impressions of leadership, optimism, and resilience. News of his passing reverberated nationally and internationally. Tributes poured in from political leaders, foreign dignitaries, and citizens who remembered him as a symbol of American ideals, a masterful communicator, and a figure whose vision had helped reshape the late 20th century. The state funeral and memorials reflected both the public stature and personal humanity of Reagan. Military honors, ceremonial processions, and eulogies commemorated his political and diplomatic achievements, while private ceremonies celebrated the husband, father, and friend whose presence had shaped lives beyond politics. Across the nation, Americans reflected on the arc of a life spanning the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and the dawn of the 21st century. Ronald Reagan's passing illustrated a universal truth. Regardless of power, fame, or accomplishment, mortality remains the final arbiter. Yet in memory, his life endures, a testament to leadership, vision, and the enduring human desire to inspire hope, even as the body ultimately yields to time. George H.W. Bush, 2018. George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st President of the United States, lived a life of service, spanning nearly a century of American history. A World War II naval aviator, congressman, CIA director, vice president, and president, Bush's trajectory reflected the arc of 20th century leadership. Yet, like all who had held the highest office, his final chapter was marked not by power or policy, but by the quiet surrender of the body to time and illness. In his later years, Bush faced the challenges of advanced age. Parkinsonism, a progressive neurological condition, gradually impaired his mobility and coordination. His once commanding presence became more measured. Walking required assistance, speech slowed, and daily routines were punctuated by the limitations imposed by frailty. Yet despite these obstacles, Bush remained mentally alert, maintaining correspondence, reflecting on history, and engaging with family and close friends whenever possible. By late 2018, his health had declined rapidly. Recurrent illnesses and the cumulative toll of Parkinsonism weakened his resilience. Family members observed the gradual retreat of a man who had once led the nation through the Gulf War, navigated the end of the Cold War, and overseen a presidency marked by diplomacy and pragmatism. The body, long a vessel of endurance, began to fail. On November 30th, 2018, at his home in Houston, Texas, George H.W. Bush passed away at the age of 94. Surrounded by family, his departure was peaceful, yet it marked the conclusion of the longest-lived presidency at that time, a life that had witnessed nearly a century of global transformation, conflict, and change. In his final moments, he left behind the indelible mark of a lifetime devoted to public service, diplomacy, and leadership under the gravest pressures. The nation responded with profound reflection and mourning. Tributes poured in from political leaders, international figures, and ordinary citizens, celebrating a life defined by integrity, duty, and humility. Bush's legacy was one of measured leadership, of quiet diplomacy, and of a steady hand guiding the nation through both domestic and global challenges. The public ceremonies and memorials reflected both his stature as a statesman and the personal warmth that had defined his interactions with family, friends, and colleagues. His funeral echoed with tradition and solemnity. Military honors, ceremonial processions, and eulogies commemorated his achievements as a wartime hero, vice president, and president, while private family moments captured the personal dimension of a life lived in service and commitment. Across the nation, Americans remembered a figure who embodied both the responsibilities and the humanity of leadership. George H.W. Bush's death underscored the inevitability shared by all who rise to the pinnacle of power. No office, no accomplishment, no influence can forestall mortality. Yet in memory, his life endures as a testament to decades of courage, public service, and the quiet dignity of a man who bore history's weight with steadiness and resolve. The passing of Bush closed not only a personal chapter, but a generational epic, linking the sacrifices of the past with the ongoing story of the American Republic. From George Washington's sudden fever in the winter of 1799 to George H.W. Bush's quiet passing in Houston over 2 centuries later, the story of American presidents is, at its core, a story of mortality. Power, ambition, and historical consequence could shape nations, influence wars, and alter the course of human events, but not a single president could escape the ultimate truth: all life ends. Each president faced the inexorable decline of the body differently, yet the pattern is hauntingly universal. Some, like Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, were struck down violently, their lives severed in a single, cataclysmic moment that shocked a nation and left the world in collective mourning. Others, from Thomas Jefferson to Harry S. Truman, succumbed gradually to the body's weaknesses, diseases, heart attacks, strokes, and the slow ravages of age. Their final hours, whether public or private, were suffused with the poignancy of inevitability, underscoring the fragility of even the most powerful human lives. The narratives of their deaths reveal both the era in which they lived and the limits of medical understanding. George Washington's treatment, which included bleeding nearly 5 pints of blood, reflected 18th century medicine's misconceptions. William Henry Harrison's 1841 death, barely a month into office, highlighted how exposure and overexertion could swiftly prove fatal. In contrast, the 20th century presidents, from Eisenhower to Reagan, faced slow declines mitigated by modern medicine, yet still inescapable. The evolution of medicine is evident in these stories, yet mortality remains unassailable. Beyond the physical, these deaths illuminate the psychological weight of leadership. Many presidents, like Ulysses S. Grant, labored to secure their family's future even as illness gnawed at their bodies, demonstrating the intersection of personal ambition, responsibility, and mortality. Lyndon B. Johnson and Ronald Reagan faced the decline of their faculties, reminding the world that no matter the power wielded in life, all leaders ultimately encounter vulnerability. The body, in its final hours, demands humility from those accustomed to command. The symbolism of these deaths extends further. Dates like July 4th, which claimed the lives of Adams, Jefferson, and Monroe, intertwine personal endings with national reflection. The passing of presidents mirrors the nation's own history, triumphs, crises, and inevitable transitions from one era to the next. In each death, there is a silent lesson on the temporal nature of influence, the impermanence of authority, and the unyielding passage of time. For the living presidents, as for all humans, the final chapter remains unwritten. Mortality does not discriminate between triumph or scandal, heroism or failure. It approaches all, regardless of office, wealth, or fame. From Washington whispering, "'Tis well," to Bush's serene final breaths, the arc of history converges on a single point. Life is finite, and death, though varied in circumstance, is the ultimate equalizer. In the quiet aftermath of these departures, we are reminded that history is shaped not only by actions, but also by endings. Presidents, once symbols of power and leadership, return to silence like all who have preceded them. Their legacies endure in monuments, laws, memories, and records, but the lives themselves end in the stillness that awaits us all.